Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we explore theories that we think are going to change the way that we see the world tomorrow. And in order to do that, sometimes we have to go deep into the past because a lot of the theoretical space of the future seems to stem from ideas that are often passed over and lost deep in years before. To that end, we are discussing the philosophy of Henri Bergson today, who was apparently one of the most famous intellectual figures in his day around the turn of the 20th century. He was influential in discussions as wide-ranging as physics and music and literature. He actually ended up winning a Nobel Prize in literature in his day. And his name has come up over and over on this show, especially when Nasi and I have strayed into discussions about the border between metaphysics and science. We obviously live in a highly technical society today, where science seems to be the guiding light for a lot of our state crafting or orienting ourselves collectively in a democracy towards decision-making, and it seems to have come at quite a cost. So we're very interested in what happened to metaphysics, what happened to a basis of reality that isn't simply broken up into little bits and pieces and managed in this scientific sense. So with us today, we have Jack Bagby, who is a philosophy professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he is a Bergson expert of sorts. He's also a musician and a composer, and he has transferred his understanding of Bergsonian metaphysics into the musical domain, and he's taking us deep into the theoretical basis of why sounds are pleasing to us and why we need unpleasing sounds and how we mix those together and what comes out of it, and into the fact that music forms a representation of reality that seems to transcend ordinary scientific or linguistic communication.
At its base, the argument that Bergson appears to be making is that it is impossible for science to fully describe the world. And that is something that we have been on about for a very long time. So it's kind of a relief to have somebody who could come by and explain the philosophy that underpins that in a clear way. So big thank you to Jack for that. The other things that we do as part of this show are challenging paradigms all over the place. And one of the paradigms that we believe is almost on the verge of falling apart is that of the Big Bang. There's been a lot of news recently about the fact that we have this fancy new telescope that can look deeper and deeper into the edges of the universe than ever before. It's upending the last 40, 50, 60 years of cosmology, and what we're doing this summer is we're pulling together all kinds of different schools of cosmology, from plasma physics to variable speed of light, to Machian gravity, to the liquid metallic sun, and we are getting everybody together in a room in Portugal, in front of an audience of you, to talk about what this means for the future of science. So if you want to join us, there's a link to Beyond the Big Bang in the description. We really hope that you will be able to join us in Portugal. If you do not have the funds or the ability to travel and you still want to support the podcast, consider coming over to patreon.com. For just a couple dollars a month, you can give us the fuel that we need to keep this ship going. Podcasts, although they are relatively cheap, are not free. And so it helps us make sure that we have enough gas in the tank for all the episodes and conversations that we want to host.
And it means we don't have to have sponsors and sell garbage that we don't care about. We are serving you directly. We work directly for you, but we need for you to help us pay the bills. So check it out, patreon.com/DemystifySci.
One of the best things about the Patreon is that we get together with our patrons every week. We have done it since we launched the podcast. I think we've only missed like 2 or 3 Sundays. And we get together, it's turning into a really cool intellectual salon where we kind of talk about the metaphysics. Right? The show is about the science, and the chat seems to be more and more about the metaphysics of the things that perhaps science is seeking to answer, but has not yet figured out the tools to deal with.
Yeah, and you're welcome to preview some of those hangouts too. We're posting them publicly on Patreon now, so if you go to our Patreon page, you can see what's up. And if you want to join in, become a patron. Give us the tiniest piece of your paycheck or all of your paycheck, whatever you can afford, and help us power this program.
And with that said...
Oh, hold on. Before we go, I wanted to mention that we have finally launched our new series at the podcast called Paradigm Drift. We had our first taping of the game show. It was incredible. And thank you so much to everybody who participated. But if you have a theory of how something works in the universe that you have been dying to share with the world, consider putting together a very abstract version of that theory and sharing it with us on Paradigm Drift Live. The next taping is going to be March 25th. It's at 6:30 Pacific. You basically get a minute to present that idea, and then Anastasia, myself, and our guest panelist will interview you about the idea, about who you are, where you came up with it, and all of that. So check it out. We'll put a link for it up here. It's also in the description, and I hope to see you at Paradigm Drift.
And with that said, enjoy our conversation with Jack Bagby about Henri Bergson and the nature of metaphysics.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Even defining metaphysics is really hard. So maybe you can just define what the heck metaphysics is for us so that we can take it apart a bit.
Yeah, well, for Bergson, metaphysics is, he uses the word idiosyncratically, so he gives it its own meaning, which, well, that is, okay. He gives it a new meaning, but he does adopt some of the old, which is metaphysics is about the whole rather than the part. So that he has in common. And like in his text, An Introduction to Metaphysics, he says, all philosophers and scientists have always made a distinction between the absolute and the relative. And he's like, I want to start there. And metaphysics is about the absolute, while science is the relative. But the better definition for Bergson would be the science that dispenses with symbols. That metaphysics somehow is going to be a systematic knowledge that is rigorous and that builds with a method, but what it uses and produces is not mediated by symbols, and it doesn't land in symbols in the end.
That's really interesting because I always approached poetry and music as somehow symbolic of, I don't want to say physical reality, but let's say existence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different aspects to this. One would be that our immediate experience, which is what Bergson wants to study when he studies metaphysics. He calls it duration, he calls it consciousness, he calls it immediate experience. Every moment in our experience is unique and different. And if each moment was going to have a symbol, it would be a symbol that is absolutely, utterly unique to that moment and cannot be superimposed or substituted with any other symbol or moment. And that, if you create a language that way, you can't say anything. Now, you could maybe say language can operate in other ways, like through music. And in music, the generality versus concrete, the individual and singularity versus the repeatable and general is somehow in play in musical form in a way that's different than language. When I say, how are you doing today? I'm feeling happy. Happy is supposed to be something that describes not just this moment for me in the unique moment in my life that is today in my history, but something that is abstractable from that, generalizable, that you could feel and I could feel, and it would be different maybe in certain respects, but we know what we're talking about. So Bergson says that we move in the direction of science first through sociality and the want to be able to communicate with each other about what we feel and think. And that's fine, but if we go in that direction using only those tools, we will completely lose any reality that has this durational quality, like our immediate consciousness and life and all of these other phenomena he's trying to.
And what you said in the video that was equally fascinating was that if you go too far in the other direction, you end up with fantasy, unreality, mysticism, something that also loses touch with that center.
Yeah, and Bergson says philosophy is this grueling, like his version of philosophy is this grueling process where you steep yourself in research from a vast number of areas and try to find evidence within them that somehow converges in an idea that you had not thought before. So in order to do metaphysics and philosophy, he thought he needed to be reading all of the psychology, physiology, and then eventually evolutionary biology in his later books. But in each time, what he thinks you need to do is read as much as you possibly can on a topic from as many possible perspectives, and then through that kind of magic effect of consciousness, something new can come out of it, which this is the sort of metaphysical creative aspect of consciousness. And
So,
yeah,
so really quickly,
Yeah.
what would be an example of a metaphysical statement, and what would be an example of a scientific statement in this context?
I think that it's hard to say that you could have a metaphysical statement, perhaps. Language can be used evocatively and metaphorically in order to talk about our immediate experience. Like I could say, in our experience, there are two moments, the one before and the one after, meld into each other. You can't say where the other stops. There's this qualitative shift happening, whatever. I can describe that. But ultimately, it only matters and only has any value if you could look inward at your experience and see how it verify it with your own inner experience, right? So language can be a kind of vehicle for metaphysics, and in that sense, oftentimes I think metaphysical language will sound poetic, even if its goal is not poetic. Its goal is to sidestep symbols and get us to experience firsthand the becoming of our consciousness and the process going on within it.
So is this something that actually can be transmitted between people, or is it purely an internal experience that orients you towards some kind of insight that then can be put into symbols and language and science and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to speak in the most absolute terms and like the starkest way, no metaphysical reality could be purely put into language. The only way to access it is to be a consciousness that understands itself through itself without mediation to concepts, right? But we can do indirect, maybe you could say, you could use indirect method to get at it. And he outlines this in his book, An Introduction to Metaphysics. He says, when we want to understand the experience of time, what we need to do is create a series of images that both connect with each other and point at the same thing, as well as dissipate one another and kind of mutually eliminate one another. So he says we can think about it as a ball of yarn that is unrolling gradually. But we can also think of it as a ball of yarn rolling up gradually. And then we can think of a rubber band. And as you pull the rubber band, it gains tension. And somehow when we're experiencing like a melody or even listening to speech, the past moments are gathering up and they're becoming tenser in our consciousness as it grasps a larger and larger amount of moments. And he gives a series of other examples, like a light spectrum moving from red to orange to yellow, gradually moving through an infinity of shades of nuance, and yet there being a continuity to it. Okay, so now we have like a handful of images. He gives a couple more, but let's start with that. We can find that there's aspects of each image that we can't superimpose on one another. So it's not as if we're just taking all of these and saying, okay, these are all the aspects. Now totalize that and create a concept of it. But instead, when we imaginatively go through this exercise and think about it, it tends to push us in the direction of coinciding with our own inner experience of time and beginning to do that investigation for ourselves and then attempting to translate that into symbols that we can talk about, right? But knowing that it's always can only go so far.
Is there some aspect of this that is kind of attempting to get at the place where ideas and insights come from?
Definitely. I think that's like kind of the central kernel throughout his philosophy is creativity and how that's possible. And an interesting connection here that I've thought of that is with Ernst Mach, who's like an anti-metaphysician, but actually Bergson and Mach are extremely close to one another. And I gave a presentation on this last year. And I think that that really highlights, because what Mach is against when he's an anti-metaphysician are all the same things Bergson is against. He thinks that we project into the phenomenon all of these aspects of our practical consciousness, things that like logistics and logic even is based on more on logistics and cutting things up and managing them. And he wants us to instead, in physics and in science, to use concepts, to base our concepts on water and fluidity and movement. And the whole question of movement and its relation to the universe, the part-whole relation, the mereology there, is metaphysical in Bergson's sense. So I could say a bit more about that if this is an interesting thread. The one. All right. So the really interesting thing for Mach is the bucket experiment. You know about the famous bucket experiment.
Mach has made many appearances on this show.
Okay, beautiful.
We're obsessed with his interconnected ideas about the universe, for sure.
But let's lay out the bucket experiment, because I can never assume that everybody has gone through the 20 odd hours of Machian cosmology.
And it's fun, like thought experiment. So I guess you're in a room that you don't know is spinning somehow, but we'll just not wonder how you got there. And the room is spinning at a constant rate, so you can't tell, right? And there's a bucket of water in the direct center of the room. And so the surface of the water is concaved because of the centrifugal force. And so you see this bucket as concaved, even though from your reference frame, you can't see any movement, right? And this points to the reference frame relativity of movement, that basically every movement can be looked at as either inertia or motion, right? Depending on the vantage point. Well, then the question is, how far can you get out? Is there ever a reference frame that is the reference frame of all reference frames? And this is the big no for Mach, right? You ultimately can never take into account the total system of movements and inertia. And when we think about the whole as this background of all movement or inertia, what we run into is a problem where we can no longer use the concepts that we used to get there, right? We got there through the concept, basically, of a closed system where you can measure what's going on in it and you have a frame of reference for it. But if there is something always outside of a frame of reference, then if we're going to talk about it, we're going to need new concepts to talk about it. And I think that this question was a question that Bergson asked, and that the Gestalt psychologists at the time were asking, and Mach is considered oftentimes one of the fathers of Gestalt psychology. But this idea of the background and what can't be directly conceived or apprehended or represented in consciousness. And so, well, there's a number of...
Well, it's a hell of an approach, compared to what we do in science, which is relatively straightforward, because we're always isolating things, and there's a lot of power in being able to do that, because you minimize your variables, and you can make some definite statement about a really simplified version of reality, but it always falls short, I suppose. And if you're trying to explain very real phenomena in everyday life, like inertia, that might not be a sufficient approach to do it. That's what's really disturbing. And I think the closest you can do is approximate everything else by the fixed background stars or something like that. Like, there are approaches where you try to actually make your experiment as big as you can, the universe that you can see. But at the end of the day, it is an artificial approach to reality. And so it's like, that's science's strength, but it's also its weakness at the same time.
Right.
And it kind of strikes at a deeper question that we're always sort of passing back and forth, which is, how much can science actually explain? Is it possible for it to explain everything? People are always in search of, a theory of everything.
Laplace. Yeah,
Even the fact, I always bring this up, it's worth doing again though, but it's so bizarre to me that cosmology landed in the Department of Physics, of all places.
Mhm.
That's a really, really profound and
Yeah.
not, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but it could have gone
Well,
differently.
that's where Mach is so and Bergson are so close to each other again, because they want biology to take that place over physics, right? So my paper that they gave at this conference was called "The Organization of Sensation," and I really think that brings it all together, because for Mach, he's an anti-sensationalist, first of all. So our sensations are not atomic bits of information like Hume and other empiricists. It is impossible for any data within our sensation to be looked at in isolation from the composite that it forms in our perception. And perception works through adaptation. And so all of our perceptions are shaping those sensations in a specific way by compositing them into a whole. So, I mean, the examples of music are very instrumental here, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But if you play a certain interval and you alter the tonic or the bass note that interval is played in, you are radically going to change how that interval feels, because it is composite within a larger set of sensations. So you never have a sensation that is isolated in the way that we can imagine a dot of yellow on the screen that becomes part of the color patch, right? We've totally used the wrong tools of approaching sensation, and what we need is actually an organic view of this composite, based on biology. But yeah.
Is meditation kind of an attempt to winnow that down to single sensations, though?
How so?
It seems like it's a process of being able to focus on a single sensation, to focus entirely on the breath, to focus entirely on, relaxing a certain muscle, to be able to
But
tune.
what do we mean? What do we mean by like a single sensation there? Like, I don't think it's so. One thing is that at the time, everything was about the instant and being able to measure the instant. Like, what in one instant do we perceive? So they would do all these light experiments where they would flash something and like see how long it takes you to comprehend a sensation. So if our sensations are these instantaneous jolts of intensity or something like that, I mean, that's not what the breath is, right? The breath is this thing that unfolds in duration and has an in and an out and like an in between at the top and the bottom. And so you could think of it being a composite whole that has unity, even though it's a multiplicity. And that is what he thinks, but it would then be a composite sensation, right? And you could say, well, what about that one instant? And can we grasp that instant as a part of our perception or our sensation? And I think that that's where he disagrees with the empiricists and the associationists, who want to say that we have all of these instantaneous moments that are somehow then put together. Bergson criticizes this idea later, calling it the cinematographical mechanism of thought, which a cinema camera or a projector actually, shoots a bunch of static images, and then we see motion. And so we think that a continuum is actually a bunch of discrete entities underneath it. This atomic approach, Mach calls metaphysics and throws it out.
It's interesting because at some level of, what's the word? At some frequency level, at some temporal domain, discrete parts can masquerade as continuum, right?
Well,
like
they do
the digital
in film.
recording that we're doing right now, for instance.
And film, yeah.
But it also seems to make a critique in that, by way of that, towards the idea that intelligence can be abbreviated by bits. And by way of doing that, it makes the criticism of the project of artificial intelligence seem impossible at the end of the day, because you're missing some hole in all of the little pieces that you try to encode about what it means to be intelligent. Have you thought much about how this relates to what's
No,
unfolding?
I think this is very closely related to what Bergson is talking about, and him and Bertrand Russell were kind of fighting over this throughout their lives. And so Bergson uses this, I guess you could call it a metaphor or an analogy, although it's deeper than that, but an analogy from calculus of a curve, right? So a curving movement is described by a integral. And this integral is a simple, you could think of it as a simple representation of something complicated, right? It's complicated because curving is actually there's a lot going on, right? And you can describe this through the tangents, which you would call derivatives, of which there are an infinite number, right? And so this alternation of perspectives between the unity of an infinitely complex multiplicity, which is somehow simple, right? And all of these derivatives, which are not they're not curves, they're lines, they're straight lines that touch the curve at a single point. And this goes back to ancient Greek mathematics, but squaring the circle, the line that curves is not in reality made up of an infinite number of straight lines. An infinite number of straight lines translates that reality into a derivative. And this is the exact same thing that we do in metaphysics when we look at movement or duration or consciousness and try to understand it through these instantaneous freeze frames.
Or symbols, I suppose, are somehow approximating
it's the
curve.
same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's really interesting. It's interesting how. So this almost reminds me of Zeno's paradox, where you'll never get anywhere
He talks
because
about in every book that Bergson talks about in every single book he wrote.
And that was one of the essays that you sent us. You kind of took apart his relationship to calculus and to Zeno's paradox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you want to lay some of that out?
He says metaphysics begins with Zeno, with Zeno's paradoxes, because it forces us to confront the limits of analytical thinking. And what it shows us is that there is an integral reality and a derivative reality, and it doesn't. It's a negative moment, perhaps, because it doesn't give us a method to do metaphysics. Like Zeno just says, "Here's the problem," right? Motion becomes impossible if we want to understand it in terms of space, basically. And this is Bergson's big claim in his first work, is that along with symbols, translating our experience into symbols, we translate into space. So we imagine, two moments standing outside one another on a timeline. Or we try superimposing one sensation on another one, right? So if a sound is getting louder, how do we know it's louder? The analytic psychology will say we superimpose them on each other in our imagination or in our memory or something like that, and try to compare them. And Bergson wants to push us towards a non-spatializable form of transformation and change, right? So
can you elaborate that a little bit? Yeah.
In terms of movement, and like Zeno, the one thing he always brings up is Henry Moore and Descartes' letters to each other, where Henry Moore is sort of lampooning Descartes' relativistic view of movement, that all movements are just relations, external relations between things. And Bergson and Henry Moore want to say, no, there's something like the internal integral perspective of movement, right? That can't be just the lines that tangent the curve, but is the intention that curves continuously across a movement, right? So Henry Moore says, when I'm sitting here on a bench, when Descartes sitting there on a bench and I'm running by him and I'm sweating, I'm clearly the one in motion, not him, right? Obviously, from the relativistic perspective, you could see Descartes as moving and Henry Moore as stationary if you change your reference frame. But if, basically, the internal effort that is within our lived sense of movement will forever be impossible if we only look at things in space from the outside.
Say that last sentence again. I'm hanging on for dear life.
the inner sense of movement that we have when we experience the curving movement or whatever, will only ever have tangents that convert the reality, the inner reality of movement, into something derivative. I mean, we can think too of like, as something moves through space, we then look at the path that it has traveled as the measure of that movement. But the movement itself is not what the movement produces. It's what the movement has already produced, right? It's what it has accomplished so far. So if we want to understand movement through space, we'll only ever have the product of movement and not the movement in itself. And in order to understand the movement in itself, according to Bergson, we have to see it as analogous to our own experience of movement within our motricity, our mobility. And literally, like, if you drive a car around a corner, you can get an intuitive sense of what is entailed within curving, right? Like, if I let go of the wheel, the car is going to go off at a tangent. So there's this tension within the movement that you can feel in the steering wheel. And that if you imagine curving as a continuous motion, you imagine a kind of tension within time and within, which is also intention, right? He's using these words intentionally based on the same etymology.
Okay, so it seems like this is drawing out two different worlds, that of internal experience versus that of external measurement.
And communication.
And let's start there. Is that accurate?
It is somewhat accurate. Because he's not committed to an internalist view of subjectivity. Well, to be fair, in Bergson scholarship, people look at this between his first and his second book, that perhaps Time and Free Will does go in the direction of subjectivity and time being completely internal and subjective, and then space being this externalization through measurement. In Matter and Memory, his second book, he has a much more nuanced view, which is based on a new approach to matter. I mean, we should go here eventually, but maybe let's wait on this because it's a whole other can of worms. But
so I think that if we can say that there is a moment in his thought process, which is earlier, that does treat this as being internal versus external, measured versus experienced, then I wonder if we can also say something about the outcome or functionality of looking at the world that way. Because it's very easy to look at the outcome of interpreting the world through mathematics, because all of the sudden, if you have dynamic mathematics, you can build complex machines, you can do the Industrial Revolution, you can end up at cell phones. It's like, it's very fancy, it's very nice, it's very good. And so
you can also destroy the world, it turns out.
Exactly.
yeah, absolutely. And so then
very efficiently.
Absolutely.
With increasing efficiency.
So the question is, what is the corollary of utility in this internal perspective of understanding motion, not through the tangent lines and the differentials, but through the actual experience of the curvature? Like, what does that give you? What does Bergson think? What is the value in that?
Well, I mean, it solves a bunch of problems in psychology and physiology. It helps us understand what is unique about human experience in the fact that it has indeterminacy and a degree of freedom. So he's a compatibilist when it comes to freedom. He's not like, we have this absolute freedom. But how is it that we can be creative and have indeterminacy and adapt and change and evolve and innovate, right? I think the question of innovation was really on his mind, and he read Herbert Spencer, who is a hardcore mechanist, and he realized that innovation becomes impossible, and that was the key question of his thinking. And I mean, he looks.
Can you break that down a little bit? Why does it become impossible for Spencer?
Well, I mean, one reason would be the Laplacian determinism, for example, that whatever happens in the future is already determined in prior states. But even if you attempt to think freedom from within that perspective or within that paradigm, we end up failing. And he says that Kant, who's a champion of freedom, is also using the exact same analytic tools to understand consciousness, and so ends up saying freedom is impossible to have any intelligible knowledge about. And Bergson wants to say, no, that's only because we're using these symbolic tools. We're cutting up our experience into slices, and then we're trying to figure out how that's being combined or something by our consciousness, and how freedom could like insert itself within the deterministic frame.
Now, now, I'm going to make the claim that art is a better way to capture those experiences. And I don't know if any of these fellows agree with me or disagree with me, but music seems to try in some sense to do this almost scientific process of capturing the internal profundity of an experience and relating it to other people. And it seems to work too. That's what's really freaking crazy about it, is you go to a concert, you have your mind blown, you're feeling something and perhaps I would like to think you're feeling what the artist intends you to feel. Or as a musician myself, I would like to feel that I make people feel what I want them to feel. So how do you square that circle exactly? And you could totally disagree with me too. I don't know. But it seems...
No, I completely agree. And I think Bergson very much agrees. And aesthetic experience was always an essential touchstone for him throughout his work. Even in Time and Free Will, his first work, he wants to say, so the original title of that was the immediate data of consciousness. And he wants to say that within our immediate data of consciousness, we have aesthetic experiences, and they involve a unique durational sense of intensity that the physiological explanations cannot explain. So we gradually change the way that we're experiencing throughout the process. So one thing we can think about here is entrainment within rhythm, right? You start to hear a rhythm, and you attune yourself to that rhythm, and you start to expect it to continue, right? And this creates a durational thickness within the temporal experience of music, and we if we try to convert this into quantities and symbols, it's not adequate to the experience, right? I mean, there's something that we can usefully talk to when you tell a doctor my pain level is 7, right? Well, then they're going to ask, is it sharp pain? Is it dull pain? Right? Like, there are other qualifying aspects, and the quantity is only relatively useful for our communication, right? But it's not getting at the singular quality of that experience, right? And
how does music pull it off at the end of the day? I mean, obviously it's not perfect, but it does seem to approximate something about inner experience. Okay, let me back this up.
No,
so dreams are crazy, right? So you have this dream. This happens like almost every morning with Nasi and I. Like, man, I had this crazy dream. And it's funny when you try to tell someone about a dream, because you very quickly realize, like, this is meaningless to them. Like, none of this matters. Like, the worst thing is having your friend try to explain a dream to you, unless it's like completely goofy and off the wall, which is kind of fun. But but music might be able to communicate some sense of the profundity of that experience. And I think musicians are always trying to dream out loud a little bit and convey that. And so it does seem to be successful. And I'm curious, like, why you think it's successful in this framework or outside this framework, but like, what makes it uniquely qualified to communicate that in the way that simple symbology, complex symbology, mathematics, whatever, is completely incapable of?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I'm like currently dedicated to answering, and I'm writing a book about it to some degree. You say like the phenomenology of musical experience within time, and how the organization of musical sounds within time completely alters the way that they sound. If you play 2 chords in a row, I could can you hear that?
Yep.
If I play 2 major chords in a row and I start on this note, we're gonna get a Lydian scale, right? I don't know. Jane said, Jane said. But if we start on this second chord and go down, then we're actually in Mixolydian, and it's going to have a very different tonal color, and the scale is going to sound different because we've shifted the perspective on those notes, right? So
Can you play that one?
What's the Grateful Dead song?
Casey Jones is the only Grateful Dead song I know, so it doesn't matter probably.
Wait, why can't I remember?
Do you think that they captured discrete experiences that are common amongst people? Like, do the same people experience the same internal states when they hear these two different frames of reference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are. Of course, there are going to be cultural determinations that make some people feel something more strongly. Also, when you listen to a genre that you've never heard before, it usually takes some adaptation to it to understand the style and the function of certain movements. So this isn't necessarily something you can always immediately apprehend, but I mean, we'd have to go into the harmonic series, which I do want to do at some point. But
I mean, a really easy one for people to start with is just like major and minor chords or
Right.
something, right?
yeah,
Do different cultures experience major and minor chords differently?
there's some degree there, and you can also think that the classic thing is to say the major is happy and the minor is sad.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you play one for us really quick? Just
Yeah.
for people who aren't musicians.
Major, and then the minor. And sure, the minor is much easier to write sad music using, but you can write happy music in minor, and you can write sad music in major. Chopin is a good example of major tonality music that is sad. He has a number of pieces that easily fit that bill.
I wonder if some part of it isn't due to the resonant nature of experience. Like, this is probably one of my more woo beliefs, but we talked to this guy, Andres Gomez Emilson, who works at the Qualia Research Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And their entire thing is to study psychedelic experience and try to see if you can trace back something about the nature of consciousness from,
Awesome.
like LSD, DMT, all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a resonant theory of experience, which is that there's basically things that feel good are harmonic in a specific way where they set up some kind of standing resonance in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for me to say if it's the mind or the brain because they're not necessarily measuring, it's not like they're doing EEGs.
Yeah.
But it's a mathematical frame for thinking about it. And so I think that it makes actually even more sense to think of it as being in the mind because it's kind of an abstract place. Like,
Yeah.
I've never been able to pin him down about
They
this.
do try to instigate it with resonant flashes of light or tones of sound, right? There is some correspondence physiologically.
Yeah, like they did this interesting thing where they created like a sound generator, which is embedded in a bunch of cushions. And then you lie down in it and they would play specific harmonics, which would help people process traumatic memories more easily. And so they were using it as like a meditation aid. To tie this back to music, it's like if the resonant structure of the music is such that it gets into your head and affects the resonance that's inside of you, then it makes sense that you'd actually be able to have this emotional experience that is not uniform to one person. It actually lives inside of many people. And I think that books and literature are not that different.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is
Really good writing.
that's that's exactly what I mean. Like, if it's good writing and you can, and it's the same thing with music. Like, if somebody's playing music and you can feel the joints where they are, right? They're kind of like dropping their rhythm a little bit, occasionally playing the wrong note or kind of stuttering. You're not able to actually enjoy the experience. You
Right.
might be able to kind of abstractly say like, well, okay, this is a happy song, but you're really focused. I remember, do you remember we went to that open mic night in Portland and there was the lady who sat down to sing a song and she strummed the guitar and you could tell that the guitar was terribly out of tune.
Oh yeah.
And she just, and you could tell that
she just hammered through it though.
Yeah.
She just went for it.
It was unbelievable because you're like, I'm like, you must know, like you're good at this. And it was just, and it was such a quintessential experience where you're like, this is a good song and you're performing it well, but what have you done to the underlying structure of the experience? And so good writing's the same way. You read somebody who's written something, you're fluent in the language, and the experience of the reading dissolves and you live inside of this thing that your head creates and you're experiencing the emotions that the author is trying to transmit. And so I think that it's all the same thing. Artists try to play humans like instruments.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that like when we think about the role that the underlying numerical relations within chords has, I think that it affects us on multiple levels. So there is an intellectual aspect of identifying the same pattern. For example, if I play a major chord here and one there and one here, I can keep moving it, and what we have is a mathematical relation of 4 to 5 to 6, right? Like this note moves 4 times, this one moves 5 times, and this one 6 times, and that's why it has that pattern. I can move it anywhere, and intellectually, even if I'm not making a judgment or a concept or explicitly saying this to myself in language, Leibniz says we do unconscious math when we hear music. And Bergson looks at this and he's like, this is probably true, but we should also realize that these ratios of resonance within the notes are pleasurable in the organs themselves before it even tickles our intellect. So I think that this, and Mach and Bergson both talk about this, that our embodied sense of space and walking, what the speed of walking is, these things immediately contextualize our interpretation of any musical passage, right? The tempo is understood in relation to the heartbeat, or like even a line of a melody is felt in relation to how long your breath can hold, a continuous thing. And when a guitar plays longer, it has this feeling of being beyond what a human voice can do. And we don't have to think that. We never even probably think that, but we feel it in our body, right? And we use sound to hear distance and heaviness and textures and all of these things. And we're experiencing that in the musical sounds themselves, right? And
that's so fascinating, by the way, just like for all the guitar players out there, that's exactly what we're always chasing, is like, how can I get this note to sustain? Like, how can I hold this note and, go and get a bite to eat and come back and it's still going? Like, that's the ultimate goal, right? That's amazing.
Baby. Yeah. And so this gestural element, I think, is really, so I mean, obviously you can have someone performing and messing up all the time, and that's messing up your experience. Then you can have someone playing it kind of blandly. They're not messing anything up, but they're not really giving it that feel, right?
Reading the notes off the page.
Exactly. Or just a MIDI like playing it. That sense of touch, right? And I think, like, I don't know if you saw the Bob Dylan, Timothée Chalamet movie, but
no, but I plan to.
You should. I won't ruin it. It's definitely worth watching. But he doesn't sound exactly like Bob Dylan, right? He sings a lot of the songs, if you didn't know that. There are moments he kind of does that little thing that, but you still, at moments, you'll be like, yeah, that's not what Bob Dylan actually sounds like. If I remember, that like indescribable quality of Bob Dylan's voice. I mean, maybe there's someone out there who has a kind of indistinguishable Bob Dylan voice. Timothée Chalamet is not the one, but he does a good job, But that element, it's not something you can put on the paper even, right? You can't even write down that kind of stylistic, impossible to put your finger on, je ne sais quoi quality of the expression.
God, but the thing
So
is
difficult, man. It's so funny because like people can. That's the funny thing about impressions is like you can do them. Like people can actually replicate the Dylan. I have a friend who just does an amazing. He doesn't even mean to, but he does an amazing Dylan impression.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do a perfect Dylan impression.
True.
B, I think that there's something really weird about the modern project, which is to believe that it is possible to boil sensation and experience down to something that is mathematized and can be transmitted fully. And it seems like we are 100 some years down the line from the people who were arguing about this against the backdrop of physics exploding in its ability to parameterize the world. And it doesn't seem like we've gotten very far in that debate. Like, it's not like it's a settled debate where we're like, okay, there's definitely things that can't be parameterized, there's definitely things that are. We're still sitting here, and there's people that are like, no, we can build the full experience machine that will give you the experience of, like, being a bat or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is the exact area that Bergson was responding to. At the time, you had Wundt and Weber and Fechner and all of these German psychologists who were trying to measure intensity of felt experience, right? And they come up with these constants where, you know, if I whisper to you in a quiet room versus whispering to you in a loud room, the actual magnitudes are going to be different, but there is a smallest possible change from which sensation is impossible to where it's possible, right? These kind of thresholds of sensation. So they were measured, like, that was a massive discovery, that there are these measurable thresholds. But then the conclusion that comes from that is that our sensations are correlated to a stimulus that has a quantity to it in the physical world, and that all of our sensations have some minimal sensible difference, and all the time we're overcoming, minimal sensible differences in order to experience our sensations within the world. But Bergson points at this and says, if these numbers are contained within each other, 4 is contained within 8 or whatever, right? Our sensations are not contained within one another, and we cannot isolate one sensation in order to say that it has a quantity corresponding to it. Instead, every sensation is part of the total system of our psychical state, which includes our past and our nuances of our experience, the nuance of every moment being singular. In our psychical life, our sensations are contaminated by the singularity of the moments of our life. So we cannot say that this moment of sensible experience is half of this other moment, or that we could measure the one off of the other.
So is he just trying to make this case for maintaining a bulwark against scientism?
Yeah, I think that's right, and the reductive eliminativism that was present in his day and is still present today. He wants science to continue doing what it's doing. He doesn't think that there's any part of the method and knowledge production of science that demands the conclusions of eliminativism or of determinism. So, I mean, determinism, for example, they take what we use in science as a methodological principle in understanding closed systems, and they apply it to the whole of reality. And he says there's no scientific experiment that could verify that, first of all, and there's no need for that postulate other than you've already decided determinism and found this way of doing it, right?
Well, I actually think that it's really, I have the theory that it's really necessary for science to be able to say that it is capable of everything in order for it to be a viable belief system. Like, you can't have, if you have a society that gradually becomes one that trusts more and more in science as the lens through which you understand everything, there actually, by necessity, cannot be anything that science cannot deal with.
Especially in a world where the statecrafters have embraced science as the ultimate form of direction, leadership, decision making, that lends itself. There's a power vacuum there if you dismiss metaphysics in your statecrafting.
Well,
it
that
seems
was
like.
the Third Republic in France, completely. Was this scientifically based hyper-rationalism that was accepting the sort of reductionist view, that eliminativist view of consciousness.
What is it? What you've used that already? What's the eliminativist view of consciousness?
Well, it's not necessarily even a view of consciousness, because it just says there is no consciousness.
Convenient.
So like epiphenomenalism is another term for this. Basically, well, Dan Dennett kind of flirted with this idea for a while and kind of publicized it. But that not only can we, well, so the eliminativist will say, maybe there's some kind of phenomenal experience, but it doesn't do anything. It has no causal relation to the world. It's just a kind of the smoke that comes off of the fire, and reality is the fire, and the smoke doesn't do anything. So yeah, eliminativism would say there is no role for consciousness to play within reality, so consciousness doesn't exist.
Grim. What are you gonna say?
What about today in America, for instance? We all live here. It seems like we have embraced the scientific structures in our decision making as a polity or as a player on the world stage in our secular society, right? People who set up this country tried. What's up?
Well, we have like climate denial and all of this.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other issue that comes down to the management of trust with the scientific superstructure and so forth. And in some sense, I think that trust is deeply threatened because the scientists get out of their lane and try to make metaphysical claims on the universe and lose the trust of people. And they of course, have all sorts of conflicts of interest with respect to the industrial sector. And it kind of hung itself recently, as far as I can tell. But what I'm trying to get at is, like, do you think that a free liberal society of the future can get by without metaphysical leadership? Like, do we need some sort of metaphysical approach, the same way that we have a unified scientific approach in the West towards reality and decision making? At least on a good day, right? We're able to make some definite statements about this food being good or bad for us or whatever. I know it's way more nuanced than that, but that's the hope, anyways. On a good day. Certainly, we've been able to produce some interesting medicines as a result of this approach. Mm-hmm. Can we get by without a similar unified metaphysical approach?
Well, so when you say unified metaphysical approach, I want to wonder what that means.
Okay, well, I think I could add to that, which is if the process of science is attempting to asymptotically approach truth about nature, then metaphysics, a unified metaphysics, would be driven by a similar principle that is attempting to approach some kind of greater truth about experience.
Yeah.
Which would perhaps be useful in guiding our decision making as a people.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that the metaphysical and the moral are oftentimes incredibly closely linked with one another. And I mean, I think that the stark way to put the scientific technological project is that it becomes psychopathic, right? There's no consciousness and care and will behind the project. It just bulldozes reality without thinking about it. And I mean, obviously people have made parallels between the Holocaust, the way that people are treated as numbers, right, and scientific analytical thinking and mechanistic thinking. I mean, I certainly don't think that they're entirely incompatible. So in Bergson's last book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he says the two kind of paths that humans have in learning and developing and innovating are the path of discipline, which ultimately is needed for science, but if it goes wrong, becomes this brainwashing, the way that we were as Americans brought up in the educational system, oftentimes is this forced discipline rather than, I don't know, something a bit more engaging of our adaptation, our intellect, our innovation. So then the other path, he says, is mysticism, basically. And he says, I mean discipline in the most exalted sense, and mysticism in the most limited, and he has like a criterion or an assessment for what mysticism is. So there's all kinds of things that he thinks are not mysticism. I mean, one of the least mystical, things is to have a criterion for what mysticism is. So the intellect is always really crucial here. But basically, he means inspiration, and he thinks that it's one of the essential parts of mysticism is frenzy and inspiration. So in Greek, like enthusiasm is part of the mystic state. And, for an artist, enthusiasm is the muse, right? Or this kind of like almost drunken state where you're producing something, like this Dionysian kind of revelry. So ultimately what he wants is the best elements of discipline, which you always have to be kind of light with, right? Or else we turn ourselves into a machine, or we create a kind of punitive form of education. And then mysticism is this more like exploratory, inventive, aspirational side where we push the boundary. And then he looks at like Zeno again here, and he says, the discipline side is all about plotting out something that already exists and inculcating a habit where we do the same thing over and over again in order to be able to keep doing the same thing over and over again, right? Repetition versus innovation. And in order to innovate, we have to break the boundaries. We have to push beyond the limits, and we actually have to enter into the movement rather than seeing what results from a movement.
It's crazy how you need the balance of both of those things in music. Like, it's hard for me to not see music as like 100% representational. But I know that people think that music doesn't have to be representational. But if you have no ability to sense that repetition, the music feels chaotic and stilted, right? But at the same time, if it's just so repetitive, it feels like elevator music. At the same time, it loses its profundity.
Definitely.
I guess like what I'm still trying to wrestle with here is, it seems like the democracy that, well, whatever the heck we're in, this republic that we're in, was founded on the principle of separating religion out from state crafting. But what I'm afraid has happened is that we threw the baby out with the bathwater, and that by getting rid of religion, we also got rid of any sense of upholding our leadership to the highest possible standards from a metaphysical, moral, I guess moral is probably the social version of metaphysics. From a moral perspective, it's like we don't expect politicians to be God kings. And I wonder if that isn't bound to fail in some sense. Like religion, getting rid of it was probably a good idea because it's inflexible and it doesn't give us the opportunity to adjust and be innovative and adapt, right? But at the same time, what's going on? In the absence of any moral compass whatsoever that we can uphold our leadership to.
Because science can't offer a should.
No.
In fact, when I read neuroscience papers, I'm always struck by just how far away the question of should is.
Definitely. And then when you look at the technology side, the people are like, well, we shouldn't do that. Like, especially with AI and like all the like deep fake technology and stuff, people are like, we shouldn't do this. But the technological train is unstoppable. If somebody else doesn't do it, or if I don't do it, somebody else will. So I might as well do it, right?
Yeah, was Bergson preoccupied? I was actually going to ask you about this. Was Bergson preoccupied with the technological implications of the scientific project?
Completely. And he was obsessed with technology and studied it and was always so he references the cinematographical mechanism the year after it was invented. So he was right there on so many technologies, thinking about them. And in the Two Sources of Morality and Religion, in the last chapter, which was, if you think about it, the last thing that he wrote, because it was his last book, the last chapter, it's called The Final Remarks. And it really has this like final transmission. Like, this is me giving to the world of the future, like my vision. And it's all about technology and the way that basically says we need to expand our consciousness to the so technology is an expansion of the body, and it will destroy us if we cannot equally expand our consciousness to match it.
Wow.
And it's like this endless task where things are expanding and expanding. And we can think of 100 examples of kind of getting ground up by our technology, right? Like, we're all addicted to our phones and all of these things now. And so he was really, really worried about it, and worried about industrialization, over industrialization. But at the same time, he's in favor of these things. He's not a Luddite by any means, by any stretch of the imagination.
Did he have a sense of what it meant to expand consciousness? Because it's, from where I'm sitting, I'm like, okay, well, there's experience.
Mhm.
How do you expand experience to run parallel with the expansion of technological development?
I mean, there's a number of ways, I think. I mean, well, one thing we can think about is like the incorporation of like prosthetic extensions of our body. A cane used by a blind person, or something like that. The technological can expand our sense perception in that sense. But I think that there's another, well, something, there's an in between before you get to the like deeper. We need to change the way that we look at the world and what we're aspiring to and things like that in order to put our technology to good use. There's also this kind of, you could call it phenomenological. It's also adjacent to art. I don't know if you've watched this Leonardo da Vinci, Ken Burns documentary, but it really gets at this training of our sensory experience, which actually expands it. And Ernst Mach, again, talks about this a lot. Like, if we take a very simple piece of music, like the chord within a musical piece, the sense data is this composite complex thing. There's no one perspective on it that we can take. It's like these Gestalt images that were popular at the time. There's Schroeder's stairs. There's the duck rabbit. All of these things. Do you know the stair one?
Mm-mm.
Where
Like some Escher stuff?
no, it's not like Escher. I mean, it kind of is, but if you search Schroeder stairs, maybe you can throw it up on the screen or something in the editing. But basically, you see it as stairs going down, but then it flips and you see it as inverted stairs, kind of like upside down. And the cool thing with this diagram, when you look at it, you can't stay in one perspective on it. You oscillate between the two, even if you try your hardest. So it's really fun, actually, to try to keep your to preserve the perspective, the depth perspective that emerges. So this idea of like depth perception emerging from, the diagram's not changing, but our perception of it is changing, right? So the same thing applies to a chord. You can hear it from the perspective of this note, or you can hear, right? And it goes deeper than that, because the Overtone series, which I do eventually want to talk about a little bit, but every instrument draws more or less out of certain overtones, and that's what creates the timbral quality of the notes. And if I play a low note, can you hear that overtone, for example? There's a few
absolutely
audible overtones. If you're listening to that note and you hear just the fundamental, right, you're going to have one sensation. But if you listen to it and your attention is drawn to one of those other overtones, you have a different sensation. But there's no view from nowhere, right, that isn't a contextualized way of seeing that note from a perspective, right? And like, we can take this interval, which, because I had just been playing this, you're hearing it as part of a major chord. But if you were primed differently to hear it as, or like now it's a minor chord. And it's that same content.
It's like where you place your attention, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. And so our attention is the frame, and there's always a frame, and there's always a local distortion, right? The bucket being bent. Like if I drive this note into your, create an atmosphere, create a frame of reference, then
just let it drone, maybe, I guess, is the easiest way to do that.
Yeah. Then those notes emerge with the depth that they do in the gestalt that they have, that composite sensation, even though they could enter into a number of other composites that have a very different qualitative feel to them.
And this is where things get really interesting, because in the West, at least in modern times, the tradition has been to sort of flatten all these relationships in this temperament that we apply to things like the piano, right? Where we kind of find these happy averages of these relationships so that we can, so we can transpose between different keys is really what it's all about, and play in different octaves with different instruments and have it all work out.
Exactly.
And it's a really interesting crisis for musicians to get used to this temperament business, because it's actually not a perfectly resonant system. And, when you, once you get past the kind of intermediate stage of playing music and you start actually doing compositions and looking at your chord structures and recording and so forth, it really becomes something that can keep you up at night. So a good example is it's very popular now to, all instruments have this averaging for the most part in the Western world, but Can
you explain to people what tempering is? Because I think that most people probably don't know.
Yeah, I'm probably not doing a good job of it.
I can explain tempering.
Yeah, please. Just tell us where the heck the scale comes from and the harmonics. I guess we should back it all the way up, but I want to talk about what's happened in Western music at some eventually.
Well, I would say that so you have just intonation, which is based on the harmonic series. Hold
on. Let's assume that there's some people that are listening that have never picked up an instrument in their life. Intonation.
Harmonics.
Right. Well, I would say that 90% of people who have picked up an instrument also don't know what that is.
Fair.
So, on a guitar, you have to adjust the intonation by changing these things. That's not what we're talking about. It's not unrelated. It's related to tuning, but intonation, in the sense of just intonation, just means tuning.
Maybe I can back this way the hell up to to physics. So whenever you hit something, when an object vibrates, it vibrates with a characteristic frequency, and you can take a really simple cantilever. It's gonna, you smack it, or you put some impulse into it, it's gonna vibrate with and it's gonna dissipate and eventually stop vibrating. But it doesn't just vibrate at that one frequency. Exactly. Depending on the specific architecture of the object that you strike, it's gonna have overtones that accompany it, right? And there's gonna be, we can number those overtones, the first, second, third overtone. And the most dominant ones are, of course, the ones that follow it in the frequency range most closely.
Yeah, the lower numbers.
Basically, from what my really elementary understanding of this is that I think it's the second overtone is essentially this fifth ratio. So
that's the third. Oh, the second overtone. True. Yeah.
The second overtone. Yeah. And so what you can do is you can actually you can use that simple overtone relationship and walk yourself up by a fifth until you create essentially an entire piano. So you can build out the Western scale based on this simple fifth. And I forget what the ratio of vibrations is for the fifth. Is it 3 to 2?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have 3 little waves per 2 waves is the relationship.
Can you hear my guitar?
Pardon the interruption, I have to ask you for a favor. If you were listening to this podcast and you are enjoying it and you are asking yourself the question, how can I support something that I love? Think no more and just come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci, where you can sign up to donate a couple dollars a month, which helps keep the ship going. In return, you get to join our patron chat, you get the episodes early, and you get the sweet satisfaction of supporting a project that you really believe in. For now, back to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to leave it to Nastia to contextualize this as much as possible. I'm just super into this idea because I've reached that point in my musical journey where this kind of stuff is starting to really matter to me. Like I've been uncomfortable with the way certain moments in music quarterly are structured in a way that they start to bother me. Especially in this world of tuning, like where you can tune vocalists and stuff, right? So you're actually confronted with the numbers on the page often, like, oh, this note says it's out of tune, but then you start thinking about it, and you're like, wait a second, what's the actual? What are you saying here?
Yeah.
Like, because the tempered scale is also out of tune, and like, do I want to go with that? Is that necessary? Right. Is there actually a relationship that needs to be maintained in the tempered sense, or is it better that I actually have this one be technically out of tune, but it sounds more harmonic? And so I've come into this real conflict of going by the notes basically versus actually going by the ear, and started to rationalize it to myself in this way, which is just like completely, I know this is pretty naive for a professional musician probably, but for me it's like just opening this whole world where I'm just, not only doing the classic thing of like trust your ears or something, but also like trust your ears and understand why your ears are telling you that, which is this harmonic bed of knowledge that we're diving into.
Well, and I think that oftentimes dissonance is as necessary and expressive. Like one very common thing that singers do will be to, when they sing higher octaves of a note, to sing them sharp or flat, because it has such a strong effect. Like if I don't know if we're jumping directly in, but if I'm playing this chord and if I play it flat, I mean, obviously that sounds pretty wonky. I could do a different tuning, but sometimes a singer will actually do that, like drastically raise or lower a note intentionally. And when you hear it, like that kind of sounds like crap. But when a singer does it at the right time in the right way, it's indispensable to the expressive quality of what they're doing. And I think this happens all the time. And within blues, there are like well-known deviations that are essential to the blues sound. And singers are doing it all the time, and then on piano, because you can't play the notes in between, people jam, two notes together in order to get that as if it was the note between them.
I can really singing flat a little bit can kind of have this lamenting, like almost like shyness to it, and sharpness can sound like super enthusiastic almost, or like overly certain in a way. It's not just this simple like paint by numbers situation that it'd be nice if it was, but there's some, but on the other hand, right, you're missing some informational, I hate to say informational, but you're missing some representation, some experiential content as a result of that.
Well, the information is changed by the context, right? That's the big Machian, Bergsonian idea. It doesn't mean necessarily there isn't information, but information can never be given by itself. It's always composed, and therefore it doesn't have a reference frame from nowhere that determines it. But I think that another key aspect of this is that within our scales that we use, like we in the West use a very limited number of scales for the most part, major and minor, a little bit of other stuff, but certain scale degrees are very much open to being sharper or flatter, and that being very musically expressive. Other ones, not so much. And that's an interesting pattern.
Are those the ones that are tempered out of tune in the Western scale?
No. The fifth and the fourth, if those are out of tune, it sounds pretty bad. Like you don't really want an out of tune fifth unless it's very intentional. Like there are moments you could, I don't know.
But isn't it the sixth and I forget which ones it is.
The sixth and the third that are the most malleable, let's say. So you have this is a justly tuned major third.
Does that mean that
2
it's
to the
perfectly harmonic?
series. It means that this note's moving 4 times, this note's moving 5 times, and this note's moving 6 times. Now, slightly here. Actually, let me show.
By the way, your piano is doing stuff that most pianos don't do.
Yeah, let me stop there before we go any further. Also, I showed my guitar earlier and didn't mention that there are like 10 extra frets on it, and that's why.
Yeah, I was like, guitars don't make those noises.
We just acted like it was normal, but I took a saw to my
You were like, I've got the F string on the guitar, and I was like, we're gonna come back to that.
I took a saw to it and just put some extra frets on there, so you too can play in just intonation with a saw. So let me show you my keyboard setup.
Whoa, something crazy just happened.
Running up this way, you have the white keys on the piano. They're white here as well. And then these would be your accidentals, your black keys. So you could go. But these are this is 31 equal temperament. So these are about 36 cents, I think, apart from each other. That's your smallest possible interval. So I have 2 options for a minor third. And the third and the sixth, like we were saying, a third and a sixth, if people don't know, are inversions of each other. So they're actually the same interval looked at from 2 different directions, you could say. If I have this interval, I can move that note down an octave. And now I have a sixth. And here I have a third. So they're really all the same. Sixths and thirds are really interchangeable in some sense. Although clearly there's a very distinct perceptual difference, which gets at this idea that we've been talking about. But yeah, so the thirds, they have this very wide range that you can... This is called a sub-minor third. And then this would be your standard, more or less standard minor third. Although it's a little different than 12-tone equal temperament.
And you're just stretching the distance between those frequencies?
Like... Can you tell
It actually sounds really beautiful when you play both of those middle notes. It's just got this like wild fur on it.
Yeah. Totally.
That's really
This is, by the way, the most Star Wars looking keyboard I've ever seen in my life. So, like, for people who are just listening at home, he's got this
Star Destroyer.
it's unbelievable. I mean, a keyboard may have 88 keys. This must have 5 times
280.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And they're all different colors. And so, is the idea that you're as you expand away from the center line here, that you're getting into more or less harmonic versions?
Flat?
Yeah, exactly. So you have multiple sharps and flats. Instead of having, 1 black key, you have 2 for that exact same black key, right? So like on the regular keyboard, if we cut this key in half and there were 2 notes there, that's essentially the equivalent of those 2 notes, right? So this is an octave. Where am I? Right? So all the notes here are taking up that octave. They are doubled, so those are the same note, which is really helpful in certain situations. Like,
do you perform on this thing? Like, by the way, like everybody should check out your YouTube channel. You've done an incredible amount of work, and there's these arrangements, oftentimes with a saxophonist as well, that are very beautiful. You use this keyboard for these?
For that, I did not. Okay. I've actually not used this as much as I wish I had. Well, I need to use it more. It was almost $4,000. So every day that I don't work on it, or that I don't play with it, is like money gone. I don't know. It's funny. Like, I got this about a year ago, and then this past summer I wrote a bunch of piano music on this keyboard, and all my friends have been like, "What's wrong with you? You need to like get your money's worth out of this thing."
The learning curve on it looks unbelievably painful.
So yes and no. There's something much easier about it, in a sense, which is called isomorphism, which means that every chord shape is exactly the same no matter where you play it. It's kind of like a capo.
like a guitar or something.
It's like a guitar, yeah. So a guitar does it in some sense. You know how like on a bass, the scale is stays the same shape, but on a guitar, because the B string is not a fourth, it's a major third away, it messes up the parallelism. So you don't have exactly the isomorphism on a guitar. I mean, if you think about the shape of an E chord, an A chord, and a D chord, each of those chords has a different shape.
Unless you bar them.
Unless you bar them, exactly. So this is barring all the time.
That's
so a
really
major
cool.
chord is always a major chord no matter where it is on the piano. And the scale shape is always the same. So there are certain aspects of it that are very helpful. And actually for equal temperament and 12-tone music, it can still be really interesting. So here's a basic 12-tone layout. Again, these are your white keys. And then these are your black keys, right?
Mm.
But these are the same note, so it's extremely redundant. But there are times, so a minor chord, I can play the same minor chord. I don't know if you can see my thumb is under there playing that note. And then I can play it like that, and I can play it like that. So ergonomically, this is, I don't know, like if I want to play a minor, what do you call that? Dominant 7, right? Well, I can play that note here. Oh, wait, where am I? There. Right? So without this key layout, I wouldn't actually be able to play that note because I'd have to go like that. So even just for 12-tone, this adds a lot, especially for me. I'm dyslexic. I have a lot of difficulty, on a keyboard, standard, Western keyboard. When I play all the white keys, I have a scale. Now, if I want to play that same exact scale, one scale degree up, I now have a scale that looks very different, right? Like I'm using all these.
The shapes are really,
shape is
really
completely
complicated.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like this chord and that chord I was trying to do that one. Those are all the same chord, even though they have completely different shapes, right? So to learn every chord, it's not just 12 chords. There's also 3 inversions of each chord. So you have to learn a lot in order to know how to play in every single key. Versus this, you just do the same exact shape every single time.
So one of the things that I've heard about tempering is that it's necessary in order to make the harmonics work properly between like higher and lower notes.
Let me show you that, because you brought this up before about stacking fifths, and this is really the central kernel of all this. So now I've gone to another map here, which is 53 divisions of the octave. So
I could just watch you switch the colors of this thing all day.
Yeah. And you can change them. This one's custom. So I made this color layout, and I like it a lot.
It's so soothing. It's like the color of like the ocean, a little bit of sunset in there, some aurora vibes.
I actually can see people of the future playing keyboards like this. Like this actually, it actually looks like the future. Like
they're futuristic. They ought to be,
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we're still. There's this huge rabbit hole on YouTube of people who do alternate keyboards for typing as well, which is kind of fascinating.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And it's also a similar logic where it's like, hey, this QWERTY thing was actually invented to slow us down, but like, hey, we can move on from that, Like we don't have to keep doing it just because that's what people did 100 years ago.
No, exactly. Yeah.
I will hang on to my hunt and peck for the rest of my life.
I literally look at my hands and peck with fingers when I type.
That's amazing.
Nasi only does it with one hand. It's a real abominable sight.
Whatever, I can beat you in any typing competition. Play it down.
I'm extremely slow. I actually wrote my dissertation by hand.
Wow.
Before I typed it up. And yeah, I'm an extremely slow typer. I can't like take notes typing. And I chicken finger my way through 400 pages of a dissertation.
My dad's been a programmer for probably like 40 years at this point. He still does the hunt and peck, so I feel like we're in good company. My sister sees him typing and she's like, I don't know how you live like this.
Yeah.
And Shadow's the same way, but it works out. It's how I play the piano too.
Yeah. Habits, crazy. How do you break a habit like that? But so this idea of the stacking of fifths. So this tuning, the interesting thing about it is that it uses perfect fifths. So a fifth, again, is a 3-to-2 ratio. This one's moving 1 time for every period. This one's moving 3 times. And then this one's moving 9 times. And then 27 times, whatever.
God, it's so pretty.
So now when I get to this note... Oh, wait. Yeah. Wait, where did I start? Okay. Oh, sorry. Wait, what's going on here? That's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so those are all fifths. That's a series of the same interval. This note is now, well, very sharp. Versus, it's very subtle. This is now only about 21 cents. But this is the difference between Pythagorean tuning, which is always using the circle of fifths. Oh, sorry. And that slightly detuned version, which gives us the 5/4, right? The 4, 5, 6. Or sorry, 4, 5, 6.
Hold on, I'm not totally following. So there's you have different colors on the keyboard. So the central row is teal. And then you were also playing something that was farther down that was in the pink row.
Lavender, yeah.
The lavender. Okay, so the lavender, what does the lavender represent? Is that the tempered scale?
It represents the same exact scale, but 20 cents flat. So,
okay, and why is it 20 cents flat?
Because that's the difference between when you stack 5 fifths.
Yep.
And you come back around to the beginning, you're that much out of tune, essentially.
Yes, and then the lower is again the exact same scale, just dropped down slightly. I mean, it's the same as the frets on the guitar, just all being slightly offset from the other frets. So then what we were talking about before, the sixth and the thirds, you can adjust them from where they would be if we constructed them through a circle of fifths versus where they are within the harmonic series.
Yeah, so I was making the argument earlier that you could make the whole piano out of just going up by fifths. Like if you just go up by a fifth, go up by a fifth, go up by a fifth, you'll eventually construct an entire black and white keys scale. But the problem is, if you keep doing that, you're not going to come up with the exact resonant relationship as you move up in the octaves as you had in the beginning.
Yeah, this interval here is 81/64. Because if you take 3 times 3, you get 9, and then 3. Or sorry, wait, what am I saying? Yeah, 3 times 3, you get 9, then 27, then 81. Oh wait, 27, 81. Yes. So the one is moving, one time, and the other one's moving 81. Or wait,
do we have like a
right?
diagram that we could look at? Shiloh does this to me on a regular basis, where he just starts talking musical intervals, and I have such a hard, even the idea of constructing the piano from fifths, I'm like, well, how do you come back and make the other notes? Like, you're just going up by fifths, but the intervals between the adjacent notes are not fifths.
Yeah, if you you have to octave reduce them. So,
I need a visual aid.
Yeah, you have to octave reduce them. So as you get higher than this note, you could drop down, back to where it would be here, right? Because they're identical.
So you just have the frequency of it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I kind of think of it this way. Like, if you just, I think I can draw a picture in people's brains for us. Like, if you imagine a chart that has frequency on the x-axis and intensity on the y-axis, you have this fundamental note. Like I said, if you just strike a tune, like any sort of, like a string is fine, or whatever instrument you strike something mechanically, it vibrates. It's going to have this fundamental frequency, which, let's just say it's the loudest one for now. Then at some distance along to the right on the x-axis, you're going to have an overtone. Mm-hmm. The first one is an octave, so it's double that. The next one is going to be a fifth. And if you now just take your hand on that chart and put your thumb on the fundamental and measure the distance to the fifth, you can essentially start to walk that same distance upward. But in reality, if you try to reconstruct a new fifth starting with your fundamental higher up, it's going to be a different distance necessary between the fundamental and the fifth, depending on where you start in the frequency domain. So if you try to measure you take a smaller string and vibrate it, and you measure the fifth all of a sudden with that, it's not going to be exactly the same distance that your hand measures on the x-axis as it would be with the lower one. And you have to square that up somehow in order to play in multiple different octaves at once.
Okay, is there some reason why that is? Like, if harmonic relationships are this mathematically perfect
they're
relationship,
only perfect in the context of their fundamental, right? That's where the Bergson, the rubber meets the road here, is that each fundamental has a harmonic relationship to its overtones. And in order to relate all of those overtones to each other, we have to make compromises on those distances, which gets us to this tempered situation.
Okay, so this is an artifact. Can you construct an instrument where you just take a fundamental and then build the instrument out of the harmonics of that fundamental so that all the way up the keyboard it is perfect?
Which is what I have here, actually. So this strip of tape along the top is marking our harmonic series notes. Actually, I can get the lighting a little bit better by covering that up.
Can I just
that
add
keyboard's
that,
a little bit quiet. It's quieter than the Luma key if you can turn it up.
You can do that, but your upper octaves fifths won't be in tune with your lower octaves fifths.
So that's what I don't totally understand, because if
Is that
you
better?
have...
Because they're...
hold on one second, I can't hear. That's a little bit better. It's still kind of quiet. I don't know why.
Is that better?
We can hear it. It's all right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't get hung up on it.
Okay, so I've fully stopped switching
So
the camera. Go ahead.
check it out. Like, you have a low frequency. Let's just pick one arbitrary, like 400, right? The octaves are pretty easy because you're just doubling it all the way up. But in order to specify the fifth, it's going to be this 3-2 relationship, right? If you go way up in the octave space, so you're at like 1600, the relationship that you get from 3-2 in that space is going to be tighter. There's going to be less frequency space available up there to construct that. And so when you try to transpose it onto the lower octave, all of a sudden there's a mismatch in the space between those frequencies.
Transpose it meaning just like try to play it over the top of
Just
the
take that harmonic relationship, that 3-2 that you had up there in the frequency space, and move it down and slap it onto the lower octave. It's going to mismatch. It's not congruent anymore because it's a non-linear scaling.
Yeah, so I understand that part, but I'm like, what does it sound like? Does it sound harmonic at that point if you're building up, like if your fundamental is like 10 hertz, like let's not start with 400 because that's already fairly high, but like if you start at 10 hertz,
10 would be hard to hear.
10 would be hard to hear, but if you use that as the fundamental to then construct your octaves, and then from those derive your other relationships, does it sound pleasant when you listen to it, or does it sound crazy? Does that make any sense as a question even?
I mean, I think that there's a sort of drift, and things get further, like if we construct a scale using fifths based on the 3-2 ratio, we are creating a multiple series that is based on 3. But the other intervals, such as the octave, which is based on a 2-1, has its own series that is different than the 3 series, and so every prime factor will have its own series. And the major third that I've been talking about, the like justly tuned major third, is based on the 5. So there's this inherent divergence between the 5 and the 3, just as there is between the 5 and the 1, or 1-2. So if I stack major thirds, I will actually not come back to the octave. I will come back to a note lower than the octave, and it'll sound dissonant because it's just a lower note.
Mm-hmm.
And so this happens for every overtone partial that we try to incorporate. And all of the prime numbers have a sort of unique flavor and nuance to them. So Yeah,
So
so I
like,
mean,
so I think from a like a monophonic perspective where you just have one note at a time, it might sound all right to answer
Yeah.
Anastasia's question.
But you
But when
can't construct chords.
right, but when you start holding
could,
the
but they're
context
dissonant.
window open to the lower octaves, you're going to run into dissonance all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
satisfied.
And one thing that like Mach and Helmholtz and these people at the time were talking about is, you know, I have this strip. This is something that they talk about doing. You create two strips, right? And you can put this, like, let's just go to the third there. I didn't go far enough.
Sorry, can you tell me again what this is actually the distance frequency in the frequency space?
These are just marking the keys that would be the harmonic series. So let me just go through that really quick before I bring in the second one. So here's the harmonic series, the fundamental, the first, and then the octave above it, and then the fifth. And then you can see these are decreasing size intervals. The number 4, number 5, number 6, and again, 4, 2, 1 are all octaves of each other, right? So that's the geometric series, you know, N64, and then we have all of our thumb drives of 128, 512, yada yada. That's the geometric series, which gives us the octave. So then you have the fifth partial, 6, which again would be just the 3 repeated an octave up, and then 7, where it gets spicy, right? This is another prime. And this one, the 7, so this would be in 7 limit just.
And now we've moved off the white keys, by the way. We're hitting a beef. We're getting into the black keys for the first time.
And the harmonic series is very spicy. So these lower harmonics, this is as vanilla milquetoast as you can get, right? It's like a major thing. And something interesting with that is when you play a minor chord, because if I play a minor chord with this overtone is there. See if you can hear it.
Yeah, it's like sub audible almost.
And this one's there too. You can really train yourself to hear these, and this is partially what Mach is talking about. Ear training literally changes the composition of sensation and produces a new sensation, right? So, here, let me use my foot pedal.
At some point, it looks like too, like you're in between keys, like when you get really high up there.
After here, they become too tightly packed to do anymore, right? The intervals are getting smaller and smaller every single time. So at a certain point, we're no longer playing in our system anymore, which is where the Lumitone allows you to do that. So what they wanted to say was that dissonance can be understood as a clashing of overtones. If I play these two notes, the reason that they have a certain dissonance is because if I track the overtones that note is playing, it's its own harmonic series, right? Oh, sorry. Anyway.
You're basically shifting the
idea.
frame. You're shifting the frame of reference.
Because there's this way of approaching it where we're trying to solve this problem where we want things to be in tune, but we also want to be able to modulate and yada, yada, yada. How do we save it? I mean, you can create a Lumitone, but otherwise you can do equal temperament, which just says every interval, we don't care if it's exactly precise. They're close enough. It sounds pretty good. And that allows us to do all this other stuff. So there's that approach. There's another approach, which would be, let's not think about it as like a hurdle or a roadblock, but as just different ways to be expressive, right? And in that sense, a lot of times we want things to be dissonant, right? I mean, all good music, in my opinion, involves dissonance. And there are different ways to be dissonant. And we were talking a little bit about how a singer will sharpen a note or something like that. And so, I mean, I was playing before this range of major thirds. And oftentimes you will hear people stretch a note out of tune. And as a, non-trained perfect ear musician, you wouldn't even notice it. but you would feel something different. It would exaggerate the emotional quality.
Mm.
And so in the ancient Greek system, this was called harmosmana, like attunement. And attunement just says we have a certain set of scales, but a certain set of intervals, which makes up a scale. But those intervals have wiggle room. Not all of them, right? Like I showed you before, the fifth and the fourth, like you probably don't really want to mess with those too much. But the thirds and things like that, you can bend and move, and it will give you very different feeling to the same exact content. So I have video examples of this where I play Eric Satie, like a basic piece of his, and play it where, so in the Greek system, there was what they called tense and soft attunements. And basically, soft means that the minor thirds go down to that sub minor, right? That kind of like anguish minor third brought down. Versus the tense would be a much sharper minor third. So you have these tonal colors that allow the musician to draw out certain expressive qualities to those notes. So you can play the exact same melody, and it's recognizable as the same melody, in the same way that, like, if somebody sings a melody out of tune, you still know it's that melody, unless it's like really botched, right? So there's a certain amount of flexibility there, and that flexibility allows for different expressive qualities.
Okay, so with what you were showing with the black barred tape, I think while you were talking, I realized what you were saying. You were saying that there is one set of relationships that you generate if you start with the leftmost note as your fundamental, and then a second set of intervals that you generate if you treat the second higher note as your fundamental. And now tie this back into the tension that emerges as you play, because you were saying that like each note contains within it these overtones, and so you can train your ear to hear them. But somehow on the piano, despite the fact that the true overtones are in different places, it still is functional. Like you can still play those two notes together. And you're saying that the gap between where those true overtones are is what creates some of the dissonance and creates the harmonic sensation of the notes together.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And like if we take this example, I mean, this is classically in the West, the major third is considered a dissonant interval, or it's not considered a consonance, even though it's a pretty consonant interval. But the octave, if I move this strip to the octave, I'm a little off. Okay, this one lines up, this one lines up, this one lines up, this one lines up, this one lines up. I haven't gone far enough here, but literally all of them line up. And the notes sound extremely consonant together, right? And when I move it there, you have all of these conflicting overtones. And so they want to say that partially the dissonance is a function of the disalignment of the overtones. And let me just say one more thing about that, because the definition of dissonance has been extremely difficult for musicologists to define. One thing that people will say is that the smaller the ratio between the frequencies, the more consonant. So that would be lower in the harmonic series, right? Versus higher ones are more dissonant. Well, this is partially true, but it's also easily disproven by the sheer fact that if I take a note, does my pitch bend work? Yeah. If I take a note and barely bend it up and use that, like if I barely detune a fifth, I can't do it right now because it'll bend both notes together, but I could do it on guitar. But I think you get the idea. The fraction that I get by very minutely detuning that is a giant fraction, you know, a million billion over whatever you can imagine, right? And to the ear, they sound almost identical. So clearly, you cannot say that the consonance and dissonance are a pure function of the smallness of the intervals Does that make sense? Have I properly explained that? So this, like, if you take this interval as consonant, it's a 2 to 1. If I slightly tune this higher note like that, right, and I play that again, you're barely going to notice it, okay? And yet, if we described it mathematically, the fraction would be like a million over whatever. A million, what would you say? 2 million over 99,100,000, right? Because that's almost 1 to 2, but slightly less, right? So the huge number should be extremely dissonant if that's our theory of dissonance. So Mach and Helmholtz were trying to replace common views about consonance and dissonance, and wanted to show, no, it's more about how many of the overtones are clashing. And they measure this through harmonic entropy. So how much is it at odds with itself? How often is it interfering with its
with its partner, right?
Can we bring
with its partner. But it also does it with itself.
I was just thinking, can we bring your face back on so we can talk to you?
Yeah, I'm like gesturing wildly. Oh, I'm like trying to raise my hand. Okay, let's get it.
Can you mark this for me?
I have placed the mark.
I take full responsibility for editing this episode.
This is going to be one of a lot of editing. I can tell we've been kind of totally circuitous.
I got this.
I think that it's okay, because usually when trying to figure out something that is like, language is easy. And sound, if you're just in the world of sound, is probably easy too. But then marrying language to sound, this is sort of the Bergsonian thing, right? The idea that attempting to place symbols on the experience is unimaginably difficult. And so I don't expect it to be easy.
By the way, this is the same process. Excuse me. This is the same process we have to go through when we're talking with mathematical physicists, right? We're trying to translate some really complex set of relationships that has some complex symbology over physical phenomena, which is pre-extant and speaks for itself in some sense, and you're trying to kind of negotiate between the two. I feel like it's the same process, and we'll often, when we talk to mathematical physicists, be going over and over and over the same idea until we all kind of like click into like what is happening here.
So with the scales, with the you said it was a geometric scale construction, which is the perfect relationships that are derived from the fundamental?
Well, that's just the octave series.
Okay.
So if I double a frequency, then I get an octave. And if I just do a series of doublings, then I get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 512, et cetera, et cetera.
Y equals x squared, just like a geometric curve fit.
Sure.
But so then each note will have its own geometric series based on it.
Or 2 to the end. Sorry, 2 to the end.
Yeah.
Sorry, 2 to the end.
I don't think that's right, but I can't say.
2 to the end. Yeah.
Okay, so with that, let's link this back to the story of tempering, because we're saying that this is not the way that the tempered scale is constructed, and that is somehow meaningful. And so let's explore that.
Yeah. So the first temperament that came about in the Renaissance was quarter comma mean tone. And it basically, so remember when I stacked I could go back and show you, but when I stacked, that was weird. I don't know where that chord just came from. I like didn't push anything.
Goes to the machine.
When we stack fifths and we get to that Pythagorean fifth that is sharp, sorry, not fifth. We get to that Pythagorean major third that is sharp. What we want to do is be able to play the flatter one that is more in tune, the 4, 5, 6 chord, instead of 64, 81, whatever the next one would be. Right. So what you can do is, so you basically need to drop that note by 21 cents. That's what I was showing on that keyboard layout. But then if you just drop that note, then its relationship to the fifth before it is going to be extremely dissonant, right? Because we had a perfect fifth and then we dropped it down. Now we have an out of tune interval. Oh, I think I hit play on something. That's why I hit play.
So in other words, if you tried to construct an octave between those, it would be a mess. Those different octaves of fifths, like you were saying to its note before it.
Well, it would partially be that. It would also partially just be that note would then be out of tune. Let me go back to the 53. Sorry, equal temperament.
And by the way, like for the non-musical folk, like when you say cents, you're talking about the percent out of tune that note is. In some sense.
Yeah, in some sense, it's so every step on a piano is divided by 100 cents because it's a cent is 100. So an octave is 1,200 cents, right? And actually, I can show you something else that might make this. Let me share my screen really quick. Can you see this? Piano Tech?
Yep.
Okay. So this is a really cool piano patch that I've been using, and it allows you to look at the notes this way. So, what's going on? Oh, I'm clicked on the wrong. Okay, here we go. You can see where the note's being played, right? If I go, like I can move these notes however I want, right? And I can enter in values. So this would be over 2. Does that make any sense? Like what you're seeing, this diagramming of the keyboard?
It's the intervals between the notes that you're playing.
Exactly. And then the ratios here are all based on the harmonic series. So if you see 11 and the number underneath, if it's a geometric series, then you know it's a number in the harmonic series. So 8, 2, any of those. So some of these are not harmonic series numbers, but right. So you have your 7 and 11, some of these weirder prime numbers. Yeah, and you can also see here, this is showing us our overtones, where they line up. So you have that. And if I had typed in instead we could go equal temperament. You can see that those are off there, right? And I would have to go and pull it down to. Okay. So, also because this shows the cents, 100 cents, 200 cents. And if I go, here's your equal temperament major third at 400 cents. If I drop it down by about 15 cents, as I said, then you get your pure third. And you can also see here, it's marking where that overtone is. And we can see that it's perfectly in line. So, if you stack your fifths, you're going to get 81 over 64, which is all the way up here, right? So this isn't just like some arbitrary thing. It's built into the divergence within harmony itself.
And were the ancients concerned about this? When did people first start talking about this crisis and how to actually set up a musical system that was usable?
Yeah, so the ancient Greek and Hellenistic musicologists used what I mentioned earlier, which was called attunements, right? So you would have a scale, and then you would have certain notes within that scale that you tighten and loosen, and you would do this based on the harmonics. So you would find the 7th harmonic and pluck it on the string, and then tune to that, or you would do it by ear. You can do this by ear. Then so everything was its own unique system based on the mode that it was in, based on the instrument that was playing it. And it was really hard to do polyphonic music. It was hard to get multiple instruments to play together. Because each one was created for like you would have a harp in the soft attunement, and then you'd have another harp that was in a different attunement. Or else you would have a bunch of strings per octave, right? You'd have more than 12 or sometimes 15 notes per octave in the ancient Greek. Okay, so then in the Renaissance, you have a completely new set of problems. They no longer really care about all these higher frequency partials, the 7 limit, these kinds of things. They only care about the pure major third. And so how can we accommodate that pure major third?
So why is that? Why do they only? Why is the values shifted?
It's just preference, I think. I think people
Is it like orchestrally based because they're trying to get all these different instruments to play together?
That's not why they were interested in the major third. I think
Is there
that's just
theological overtones going on here? Like
there could be. There could be. Actually, 31 equal temperament, which I was showing you earlier, was invented in like the 1400s in Italy as a way to incorporate these intervals. But 31 is actually very similar to quarter comma mean tone, which I mentioned a minute ago. So if you take that interval, like I said, if you stack all these fifths, am I in? Let me just click here. Again, you stack the fifths. This note is sharp, and we want it to be here. But if we do that, then we get this, a super out of tune fifth. So what if we like this is 20 cents off, and there's 4 notes. What if we divide that into quarters, right? Quarter, comma. So the comma is 20 cents. A quarter of that comma is then distributed to each of those fifths. So each fifth is detuned slightly. I can show you this now. Let me open this.
it's sort of like democracy. Everybody's equally unhappy.
Yeah, exactly. No, everything is equally slightly out of tune. And this is similar to what equal temp. So here's equal temperament again. But if we go to quarter comma mean tone, we can see that we have the 5/4, which is our pure major third, which is the goal, right? But it turns out that our fifth is now detuned. So equal temperament is 700 cents. Just intonation is 702 cents. 3-to-2 ratio, right? But we've gone down by about 6 cents, 5 cents. And each of our fifths is now slightly detuned. And that, is compounding as we go up. So our second is actually about 10 cents flat of what it should be. And again, we can just adapt to that and it's fine. It's slightly, who cares if your second is out of tune, because now we have a pure major third. So one of the big reasons that was what they wanted is because of counterpunctal music relying on thirds and sixths and avoiding fifths and fourths. Are you familiar at all with that idea? So if you play what they call parallel fifths, I played 2 fifths in a row there, though. Sorry. It doesn't sound, when I do that, it sounds like one voice. The fifth is such a strong relationship, you can almost not tell it's 2 notes anymore. So it sounds almost like one voice moving together. But if I move in thirds, it sounds more like 2 different people singing. And if you go, if this is in a choir, the quality of their voice will make that come out more. But if it's on a keyboard, and like that was the big thing at the time, organ music and all of this, it stops sounding like independent voices if you use those intervals in succession with each other. Versus the thirds and the sixths, it always has this quality of being 2 voices moving independently.
That's crazy. I never thought about that. Is that why people often use the thirds in harmony, like vocal harmony structure,
Exactly.
like typical Nashville harmony stuff?
Yeah.
Just because you can separate the 2 voices out like that.
It sounds like 2 people singing versus kind of melding together.
Can we hear an example of that?
I mean, what's like... And then comes in the counterpart. I don't know. I'm not good at playing counterpunctal music. I'm not.
Well, can you just play a fifth and then play a third, just so we can hear?
But in this sense, when they're moving, so on the one hand, you had the ba 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 ba, right? Oh, sorry. On the top, you had the ba 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 ba, right? And on the bottom, you had da 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 da. So now, when I play that, try to hear the 2 different voices. if they were if they weren't the intervals that I'm using, this is Bach, Art of the Fugue, they would start to melt into each other. You wouldn't be able to keep two independent voices. A lot of people think the rules of counterpoint were this like annoying thing that teachers imposed on people, and then everybody was like breaking the rules, being rebellious or something like that. Well, no, if you break the rules, you just stop having that harmonic complexity within the notes. The notes tend to fuse together. And this happens with the harmonic series too. Like if I play, let's see, so this, wait, I switched my thing. Hang on one second.
Are you still in music mode? Because I
Why
think
you
that
want
The quality of the
sound isn't coming through quite as well, and I think that when you leave,
There we go. I'm back on. Sorry about that.
Okay.
I think it was when I restarted. Yeah.
like
Let me
from a
just show you
fundamental physics perspective, I guess it makes a lot of sense too that, you know, people get so used to hearing this first and second overtone, the octave and the fifth, that it almost sounds like the original note to you.
Yeah.
To the extent that I don't actually know if this is true, but somebody told me that a saxophone, the dominant note that it plays is actually the fifth, and that your mind reconstructs the fundamental as a result of expecting it to be there in the context of its overtone structure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is one of these questions I'm really interested right now is like, how does tonicity arise? Like, why is it that when we hear a certain set of notes, we then infer a certain tonic, right? And this is something, do you know the song by Neil Young, Out on the Weekend?
Oh, yeah.
It starts with going back and forth between B minor, B minor, and E major. Which if you play those, you know, ba da 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 da. What we're gonna end up hearing is that the song is in B minor, right? Because if I start just this is Dorian mode because the second chord is a major 4, and in the minor you don't have a major 4, you have a minor 4. So by doing that, we're in the Dorian mode. So it sounds like the tonicity arises there, but then it does this whole thing, you know, it goes sorry.
It's a pretty good Neil Young impression, actually.
What does it? Da 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 da. Sorry, da da da, and then it comes to this chord and does the dominant 7, and then lands on the A, and it's like, oh, okay, actually we're in A. Like clearly, by the time we get to the end of that circuitous movement, we're not in B minor playing this. It's just that we were waiting for that A to come. And so this way in which you can start with one reference frame and get a certain feel from that, but then all of a sudden land somewhere else. And oh, now that chord feels so refreshing and opening, and it feels like, I don't know, opening the window to a landscape that is on a sunny day or something like that, right? Versus where we started, which was in this Dorian, which is a more kind of minor-y, reflective kind of key. So how is it that tonicity emerges, and how can you sort of mess with that, right? How can you, based on the expectation that the sound builds, how you can actually divert that attention? I mean, classically, we have the deceptive cadence, right? If I'm like, we want it to go here, but we can use this, instead of going to the major chord, you go to the minor 6, which is the relative minor of that chord. So we would go to here. Oh, that still feels, it doesn't feel as cadency as our going to A, but still has a sense of cadence. So you can, but then you can move from there and create a new sense of tonicity. And I mean, there's 1,000 techniques here that musicians have used for millennia to modulate in this way. One of the big ones would be called a secondary dominant. So the dominant chord within Western music has such a strong power of creating tonicity, creating a sense of where we are tonically, that you can, in the major scale, the second scale degree is going to be minor. But if we go major with it, this is called a secondary dominant, and it creates a new sense of resolution. If I play this and then end on a G chord, now all of a sudden it feels like we're in G because I used that shift in tonicity. So
it's kind of like it's like you're in that spinning room from the mock experiment, and then somebody opens the window and you see that it's actually you're spinning with respect to this whole background of affairs all of a sudden, and you didn't know that before. So there was some discomfort about this concave puddle of water in the center of the room, or bucket of water in the center of the room.
This is the metaphor that is like driving my thinking on all of this. It's like kind of the central metaphor of the book I'm writing right now on this, that how can you recontextualize? So every arrangement of sensations, no matter whether it's in music or in our everyday life, has a reference frame with its own local distortion, right? The curvature is a local distortion. Even flat is a local distortion. It's just the local distortion that we're almost always in, right? So we think that's the way water is. No, that's the way water is within a gravitational field with these things remaining constant within the reference frame.
Here on Earth, basically.
Here on Earth, exactly. And so what we're doing, I like to build on this metaphor, like in jazz, we're going from one planet to another, right? On Jupiter, there's so much gravity, so the phenomena looks different. That's like going to, I don't know, the Phrygian mode, for example. In the Phrygian mode, everything is really minor and very sad and this like intense feeling. So there's a local distortion. If I play the same interval, literally mathematically the same interval, which should be the same sensation, right? If we take an information theory approach to this, it has a completely different composition and it strikes us as different, right? The same interval can sound consonant or dissonant based on how we contextualize it, whether we're on Jupiter or on the moon or floating in space, right? I mean, floating in space would be atonal, right? Because there is no gravitational pull to any specific point. People talk about these things this way, like jazz music being polytonal. You land on a planet for a minute, it has its own tonic center, but then all of a sudden something kicks it in a different spot, and now all of a sudden we've retonicized, recontextualized, and now an interval has a completely different sensational quality to it.
And some of my favorite psychedelic music and so forth will explore the chaos. Like if you listen to like a Pink Floyd album, there'll often be these spacey transitions between songs where you're nowhere for a second and you're not really even in any tonal relationship. And then all of a sudden you find yourself in one and it's like, oh, how wonderful to be here. But then maybe it was a trick because like you said, there's some other dominant relationship that's exposed, like in the Neil Young song later. And somebody opens the windows on the spinning room all of a sudden. And there's something about this contextualization that gets at the way that we actually experience existence that isn't accounted for in these rigid, closed down, like reductionist views of reality. There's something really special about music that's able to do this, capture this.
Yeah, let's come back to this and think about this exact thing. Like I'm going to play something, and then you each tell me what a feeling does this have. And obviously, we're all primed by Western music to feel certain things, but let me make sure I'm in 12 tone. Oh no, I'm in quarter common mean tone because that's going to make things weird. Okay.
It's like mystery or like curiosity or something like that. What do you think, Nastya?
Yeah, like a little bit uneasy, kind of hanging in suspension, waiting to resolve somewhere.
And then, so I think I totally agree with this idea of like this chaotic. So this is the whole tone scale, and it's typically considered as not having a tonic centering. That like dislodges our tonic centering and is used that way often. But there's another way to go dissonant, which is, so the whole tone scale is a series of whole tones, right? there's the diminished scale, which gives us, again, something very dissonant, but worlds apart. So let's hear that.
It's got like a little bit more of a hopeful sense of resolution. Like it still isn't resolved, but it's kind of, I hear a question.
You can see the planet off there in the distance at least.
It's considered to have a way stronger tonicity function. So if I take this is a diminished seventh chord, which is just stacks of minor thirds. If I move any of those notes down by a half step, I get a dominant chord. And then with any dominant chord, the resolution is like so powerful, right? So I can take any of these notes and land in a new key. I gotta do all this thinking. Right? So that chord can resolve in 4 paths. So it has a really strong tonicity power to it. Versus the whole tone scale is based on an augmented chord, which has this mystery. It feels kind of like there's something wrong, but also it's floating or something, right?
Like it doesn't have somewhere clear that you can tell it's gonna go.
Exactly.
The other one seems like it's like on the verge of, and this one you're just kind of still in the woods.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, how much of that is because of our cultural conditioning and how much of that is from the sounds themselves? And I truly believe and want to create a framework in which I can prove that it's both, but that you can ultimately never reduce what is qualitatively given in the sounds to just something that we paint over them because of our cultural relation, because of subjectivity or something like that, right? And I mean, this is in a way, a kind of transition point maybe to talking about Bergson again with his idea of matter in Matter and Memory that I wanted to say he comes up with a new metaphysics of matter. And really like, Kant says we don't get anything from matter. It's all just our painting the world the way that we experience it because of our concepts, because of the shape that our mind needs to intuit things in, space, time, concepts, etc. And the sensation is just this wash of incomprehensible stuff. Well, from there, so obviously Kant, if you're familiar, was arguing against an idea that all of the quality just comes from the sensations themselves, and the mind isn't doing anything. I look out at the world, I'm just receiving the information from the world. So the middle ground between those is where Bergson goes and where phenomenologists go as well, that there is some autochthonous, right? This word like coming from the earth. There's something coming from what is outside of us. The quality of the sound itself is determining the way that we feel it. But at the same time, our reference frame is irreducible. We can never get rid of the fact that there's a background to our sensation that it's emerging from. And that background is, of course, the total system of movements within the universe, but also our memory. All of our past memories. You can think of the total system of inertia for Mach, the background, in terms of our psychological life. And this is what Bergson wants to say. All of my past is intimately related to what is emerging in the present as the perceptive composite, right? This whole, the depth that emerges in all of this is painted or tinged by our past.
So in context of that, for the cultural perception of intervals and these tonal relationships, is there a lot of scholarship on how the cultural past of a people affects the way that they perceive intervals as minor or major, harmonic or dissonant? Or is it kind of this universal grammar of sound that is everywhere the same?
So I think that again, we need like a both and. It's impossible for me, and I think if I explain it to you, for you to accept that it's an entirely universal language. One of the simplest examples is like listening to a genre that you've never heard before, and not really knowing how to listen to it, and needing to learn how to listen to it in order for it to become enjoyable. And really, even to attend to it, you need to learn the particularities of that genre, right?
It's like jazz is kind of like that. I've had definitely experiences listening to Miles Davis where I will hear something and it's completely transformative, and then I go and I try to show it to somebody else, and even in that space of listening to it with them, I'm like, this isn't landing.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting experience.
Exactly. And I don't think that this, completely removes all possibility of there being a universality to it. And I think that we can dredge up these examples of being able, like you've been saying the whole time, like there's this feeling that we're really communicating through music, that we are actually resonating with each other, and that we're feeling something sympathetically or together in some sense. Like we really are feeling the same thing, at least partially, right? I would also say you can't listen to the same song without and feel the exact same thing twice, right? Every time we listen to it, it's tinged by the uniqueness of that new experience. Even the fact that you've heard it before changes the way you experience it. And like going back to Mach again, there's no sense plenum that isn't so complex and multifaceted that there aren't multiple perspectives that you can take on it with the ear at any given time. I think Counterpoint is a great example of this. You listen to a Counterpoint piece that has 4 voices. Invariably, you're going to pick out one of them and listen to it and hear it all from the perspective of that note. And maybe this keeps jumping and you keep going from one voice to another voice. But you basically can never listen to it in the same way twice, because the complexity of the manifold of sense data is more than you can take in at once. It necessarily has multiple perspectives on it.
That's really interesting. I'm a tiny bit distracted because I was wondering, can you play us something on your crazy guitar?
Yeah.
Like, do you have a song that you're working on so we can hear like what it sounds like?
I haven't been playing with this as much as I should. Let's see. Is that coming through?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Okay. I don't know. Here, let me grab a pick. I use a thumb pick. I don't know if that's it's the best. I don't know. You can go. I'm not getting. Oh, let me turn that on. Okay, now I'm getting a few monitor. So this is tuned in power chord.
Green Day.
Yeah. And so here I can go between these 2 possibilities of slightly detuned and then more in tune, and that adds a great effect. It's more dissonant, it's more out of tune, but sometimes that's what you want. And then when you come back to the in tune, it has a strong feeling there. I think one of this is the 7 partial again. You get this really bluesy sound. Oh, I'm I don't know. I haven't been playing guitar enough recently, actually.
I think the closest that like normal guitar players are going to get to this is bends, really, and blues. And blues notes and bends are all about modulating that tension in real time.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the Tuareg music, the like Bambino and Tanari one. There's something in the addition of these dissonant intervals that they use, but they don't have extra frets on their guitars, so I guess it's probably bends and stuff that they're doing. Yeah,
and slide, which you can do as well, and bends. A really common, there are a couple blues notes. One is this 7. So like, there's the equal temperament, that flat latter one, it just has that like feel that. Another one is the neutral third. This is another one of the blue notes. So this is a note halfway between major and minor, right? So we have the minor and the major. You can go.
It does sound so like front porch blues.
Exactly.
So real.
Yeah. And it's
so raw.
It's not so obviously sad and serious as the minor, and it's not this happy-go-lucky major thing. It's this tragic, bittersweet. Oh, and you can't like replicate that in equal temperament unless you bend. You know, it's like these notes have a unique expressive quality to them.
I'm really, really glad that you played that for us. It was really beautiful and very interesting. So thank you. I don't know. This is such a. I think that for most people, music happens not on a theoretical basis. And so it's interesting to tie this to the ideas of Bergson because it seems to epitomize it. You can take something like music and you can rationalize its mathematical relationships and you can construct new instruments. And thank God that somebody did, right? Yeah. Because we'd still be playing whatever like bone flutes the Neanderthals invented if nobody.
Which maybe those were pretty good. Who knows?
Yeah, like it's entirely possible we'd be okay. But the diversity of sounds that are available from a chorus of musicians that are able to play together, because like voices, I think naturally can modulate in a way that instruments can't. Like definitely. When I play music, the way that I compose is always through singing first, because I don't have a facile relationship to the piano. I don't know where the note is. And so I think that probably it's easier to come up with a complex vocal melody than it is to come up with an instrument that can do the same thing.
Definitely.
And so this is tied to the kind of Bergsonian thing where like inspiration comes from a place where you're not struggling with tools or calculation or even thinking about, you know, this note needs to be detuned by this number of cents in order for it to fit into this scale. And it's like, it's all this complexity that's added on top of something that speaks prior to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's really cool. I think music is maybe the most immediate illustration of it. I can't say that I understand. I mean, I understand
highest
most
form
of it.
art.
I mean, according to me, probably.
I think it's the most immediate one. Like with it's because you have to know how to read in order to be able to read.
Yeah.
Like you can't read a novel without going through all of this. And it's the same thing where you're like, well, there's some genres you have to learn to listen to. And books are kind of the epitome of that. But sounds just get you.
Yeah.
Like they're so fundamental. They vibrate you in a way that nothing else does.
Yeah.
Oh, you were always talking about how the ancient Greek poems were sung.
Of course, yeah.
And so it's like but prior to writing everything down, it's like the story and the sounds were completely unbreakable from each other.
Definitely. And Bergson even talks about the rhythm within prose as being essential to the meaning. And he actually looks, in one of his lecture courses, he looks at Descartes' discourse on method of everyone. Like, I mean, Descartes' a decent writer. I don't want to, but like people don't associate him with being like an aesthetic and like, but he parses this passage and says that the rhythmic dimension of it is essential to the meaning making of it. And I think that this really gets at, you know, rhythm is something you only perceive in time, right? If it was reducible to the instant, there would be no rhythm, right? The rhythm emerges from gathering up the past and holding it in tension with the present. And yeah.
And being able to do something interesting requires maintaining the sense of context. Which is why, like, when you're trying to come up with an idea, you can't just sort of come up with an idea on the spot. It requires scholarship. It requires familiarity with the structures that came before.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I kind of mentioned this before, that Bergson would, you know, spend years in scholarship, just reading scholarship. And basically all of his major books, he did research for like 7 years, almost a decade, and then writes the book within less than a year. And like during that time, he wasn't drafting the book. He was literally just reading, and I'm sure he was taking notes, like, of course. But it's only after this, again and again going through this and literally letting it all form into a system that isn't just taking the same pieces of information and rearranging them. Like, this is the same thing we keep coming back to, right? Conceptually, we're not just taking the same building blocks and building a house in 10 different ways with the same blocks. We're reinventing what even we're building. And also the pieces change when they're in composition. They're literally not the same information. Like, if I take the same interval and I contextualize it with different fundamental notes, I'm getting a new sensation that is sui generis, right? It's its own form that is not explainable through anything that came before it in the past. It creates a new logic of it. I mean, Mach gets at this idea with orders of magnitude, right? Mach speed on planet Earth is different than Mach speed on Jupiter, right? There's a qualitative shift that comes with that reference point.
Can you land this to Bergson's Metaphysics of Matter?
Oh, yeah. So, well, okay. He starts by saying, yeah, we're going to have to kind of like start fresh. I can't just like immediately.
No,
let's start fresh with Bergson on this. He says that, okay. He begins Matter and Memory by attempting to overhaul our understanding of matter, and to do so through what is given immediately in our sensory experience. And he says basically what we have immediately is organized around our vital needs. Basically, the way that we perceive the world is a function of our survival needs, right? I look at things and my attention is drawn to them because they're either relevant or irrelevant to my understanding of the world. And he says, so what we have is not piecemeal things, but is gestalts, it's wholes, it's figures emerging from a background. And this is entirely shaped by our vital needs. So, in a way, in order to study sensation and what is given as in matter, we need to interrupt these habits. We need to break with these habits because these habits present the world through our vital needs. And actually, the artists are the ones who do this for us for the most part, right? We go out into nature and, oh, it's beautiful, but as soon as you hear the poet describe it, you're like, wow, yeah. Now I see how detailed and how much I was just ignoring all the details, right? And when you learn to be present, and you were talking about this earlier with like certain meditations, you can meditate on a certain perception and draw more out of it, right? This the same idea in Mach, that our sensations are always more than what we can ever tap into at any given moment, and that we can learn to modulate our experience of it. So, okay, so that's sort of the background. And then Bergson wants to say that he wants to approach matter through the idea of images. And he says, I mean image in a sense halfway between realism and idealism. So it is less than a thing existing out in the world, independent of my reference frame, independent of my attitude, independent of the way that I attend to the thing. It's not even a thing, right? Because a thing is the way that I cut it out of the total system in light of my vital needs. So that's the realist side. And then on the idealist side, he says that it's more than a representation. So that's more than something just produced in me, right? When I hear the sound, I am partially overtaken by something external to me that then determines the way that my mental state is, right? It's actually imposing some qualities on me. So on the one hand, you never have a perception of matter that isn't shaped by our vital needs and our consciousness, or that we modulate in order to experience in a more in-depth and complex way. And on the other hand, it's not entirely our representation. It's not this German idealism where we're shaping the entire phenomenon based on our cognitive faculties. And I mean, so one last idea with this is that, I mean, he sides with people like Leibniz, for example, and Whitehead is very similar to this, Alfred North Whitehead, that everything in the universe, and Mach talks about this, everything in the universe is interconnected with everything else. And in order to have the determinacy of any particular thing, really you're involving the entire universe. But we cannot perceive the entire universe, right? So what we perceive is a fragment of the entire whole that makes it what it is, but only under its local reference frame with its local distortions.
I love that. I mean, I think that that's a super valuable way of looking at the world, because the idealist perspective that there is nothing there, there is no thing of itself, is absurd. It leads you to this anti-realist perspective that the moon is not there when you look upon it, and the world is being rendered, and simulation hypothesis, and all of these other things. That's just bananas.
Yeah.
The alternative, which is that, the only thing that exists is the objects, is also bananas, because experience is the thing that breaks that maxim, because Shiloh and I are always talking about
internal experience in particular.
The body is not, like, a human is not a body, it is a being. And so there is this temporal quality to it, and context, and this, I think that this is really important in evolution and in understanding, like, why there's all these different kinds of creatures on Earth, and why we've evolved to not see UV light or be able to see X-rays or any of the myriad signals that surround us. Like, it is something to do with what has been necessary for us to do the job of living. And there's this crazy thing that the scientist has to do, which is to look at something and then try to understand the thing that makes it look the way that it does, and then step outside of that. And that's kind of the mission. Like, that's the art of trying to understand nature. And I think that this is why everybody's been telling us that we have to talk about Bergson, because we talk about these ideas all the time. And it seems like Bergson is the one who really threaded all of these things together in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What do you think, Shiloh?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. Actually, I feel like I have a better grip on how to articulate, like you said, the things that we've been swirling around for weeks now.
Like, Shiloh and I had this unbelievably heated discussion yesterday about whether the electron is an event or an object. And it's like, I think that it strikes like unbelievably heated, like doors being
You got 4
slammed.
hours after this
Like, it's just hair raising. But I think that this is the thing. It's like, yes, it is clearly an event, and yet it is also, depending on how you shift that aperture of perception, also an object in motion. And depending on what you want to do and what you want to understand, you have to stand somewhere in order to be able to make claims. But you probably ought to acknowledge the place where you are standing and how it allows you to make those claims in order to make the truest claim possible.
Yeah, and like Bergson, I don't know him as well as you, obviously, but he does hate concepts. Like, he thinks they're
Really?
they're necessarily reductionist. Like, they have to squeeze out important pieces of information. Like, in order to even solidify a concept, like, you got to ignore stuff.
And like Shiloh was like, science doesn't try to explain everything
All at once.
All at once, and I'm like,
Yeah.
but you can't ignore everything all at once either. It's
But you must to do science. It's a real
Here we
go.
nightmare, yeah. But that's why science
Yeah.
can't do everything. That's why we need music and art
Right.
and metaphysics. Like
Yeah.
that's not the whole world. And if you organize your society around thinking science can take care of everything for you, I think that you end up in a really cruel and unfortunate predicament, which
Yeah.
is in some sense reflective of the modern techno dystopia.
Yeah, and I think that this is the chestnut that's at the center of all of this, which is that the thing that is required is the declaration of where you come from as best you can, is to attempt to take this indescribable awe at the universe in the cultural context and the historical one and the experiential one, and be able to somehow transmute that into language, because at the end of the day, the vibration of air is all we have for being able to communicate between one another. And so you have to do some kind of packaging before you start to make an explanation that acknowledges where you put those boundaries and those limits, because that's the axiomatic space in which you work, and ignoring that there is one. Like, this has been really interesting for me, because for me, metaphysics, I always treat it as like your set of rules. Where it's like a presentation begins, because like Descartes has this thing.
Like
where he's like,
axioms.
yeah, kind of. It's like I see it as like Descartes' thing is that the tree of knowledge has the metaphysics is the root, then physics is the trunk, and then like all of the other sciences are the branches.
Right.
And I'm like, well, then what that suggests is that the metaphysics, by that nature, is the things that you say are possible. Right? Where it's like, is the world made of objects, or is the world made of mathematics? If you can build physics out of both of those sets of principles, and if physics truly is rooted in them, then it seems like that's kind of what Descartes means. But whenever I say it that way, Shiloh's like, I don't think that that's what metaphysics means. So it's been illuminating to see this perspective.
I mean, I think that there's definitely a way that Bergson would disagree with that view of the roots and tree. He doesn't think that you need certain metaphysical insights in order to do science, for example. But that metaphysics and science, I mentioned this to you guys when we talked before, but this image of a telegraph, right, where you can send a message on a telegraph in both directions at the same time, and the messages don't impede one another. They don't mess each other up. And analogously, science and metaphysics can communicate with each other without, first of all, debating the situation, right? Well, science has this perspective and the philosopher has this perspective. This is kind of what happened in the Einstein debate, that it was like, there's two perspectives on this thing, and like, you either have to take the one or the other, and you can't take them together. And if you take the one, it totally pulls the rug out from the other one. Versus there being two sources of evidence, and they can neither one can like completely contradict the other one. Now, if scientists say eliminativism, they didn't actually produce that through science, right? So that's not a signal coming on. That's not part of the signal system. That is just creating false concepts, basically, or using our concepts to answer questions in a way that it's not suited to answer, right? If we're talking about the whole of reality, we cannot use concepts that only apply to parts, closed systems, right?
That's the key.
So there's no communication if we do that. But what does science give us? Close observation and measurement of closed systems, and in a way that it can extract certain predictable patterns and discover constants and things like that. Functions, formulate functions. Metaphysics, on the other hand, is going to sweep away symbols, throw us back into our immediate experience, and that's just step one. We need like a rigorous method for doing this. He thinks that Bergson thinks the biggest problem in the history of philosophy and metaphysics is that we've never actually devised a method for doing metaphysics, like for studying the mind by the mind. And we haven't looked at what is it about our concepts that we use in discourse with physical reality that is unsuited, right? And this is why the Zeno's paradox is so important, because it shows us that if we want to understand movement, we cannot project it into space, because space is immobile. We cannot understand movement through something that is not movement. In the same way we can't understand the curve through the tangent, right? But
you can merely approximate an understanding of it, I suppose.
yeah. Which could be practical within a certain situation, but it would not get us the reality of the thing.
What a place to land. I think that gives us a lot of stuff to think about.
Mhm.
I'd love to talk to you at some point about Bergson and Einstein, because that was kind of one of the things that was floating around as being very important, because obviously like relativity is a huge foundation for the sciences today. And I think we talked around a lot of what he had to say about that, but maybe some other time we can sit down and talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and Mach is this alternative in certain ways to Einstein that doesn't kind of undermine these ideas. And I'm really interested in how Bergson's, psychology and Mach's physics meet up here in this idea of emergent wholes that organize the parts, but that the parts are never given without being in an organization, and that this revolutionizes literally all of the scientific paradigm if we adopt this view. And then this pushes us back against Bergson, who wants to say you have science over here and you have metaphysics over here, and they should communicate. Like Mach and you have later thinkers like Ilya Prigogine and in thermodynamics coming out of Bergson who want to say, no, science can learn and can do something new. I mean, you have people like Michael Levin today, who I think is just like a Bergsonian through and through. And this
also a
points at this-
Platonist.
Sure. Yeah. Well, people will say that Bergson is a Platonist.
Mm.
Maybe Michael Levin might be more of a Platonist than Bergson. I'm
He's
not
like
gonna...
on record as saying that there's like a Platonic form that life attempts to reach, in those words, which
I think Bergson would think that society is reaching for some ideal form as well.
Interesting.
But he's against preformism, which would say that the form is somehow like a thing, like an object, something constituted and determinate. If there is a form, it is something radically infinite in its potentiality. And so we see in all these different life forms, none of them is like better or worse at approximating life as a ideal form, but they are using that potentiality and expressing it in radically different ways.
I think we're gonna have to put a pin in it, Jacques. I mean,
Beautiful.
I feel like I could. I'm not done talking to you, man. we should meet up again down the line.
Definitely.
But I really appreciate all this information you've dropped in our laps, and this has been an awesome introductory course to Bergson. I'm gonna have to go process all of this in the days to come, but we'll let you go for now.
Yeah, this was super fun.
Ditto.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if people want to find out more, one more time, remind people your YouTube channel. You have a website too or something people can find you, social media, anything like that?
Yeah, I have johnrobertbagby.com is my kind of academic website. And then I have my YouTube channel is Socratic Swan Songs, which Socrates in the Phaedo singing a song as he died, like the swans of Apollo who sing as they die. This whole image comes up in that book, so that's where the title comes from.
Heck yeah, I love it.
Yeah, let's do it again soon. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
You too.
Take care, man.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.